I want a mother for Christmas." Those 6 whispered words would shatter a widowed cowboy's carefully guarded heart and change 3 lives forever. In the frozen heart of Montana Territory, 1883, where winter claimed more than just the warmth from the air, a little girl's Christmas wish and a schoolteacher's unexpected arrival would prove that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in second chances. This is their story, a tale of loss, courage, and the kind of love that refuses to stay buried beneath the snow. Before we begin, I invite you to stay with me until the very end of this journey. Comment below with the city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel across the world. Now let's step back in time to a Christmas that changed everything. The wind cut through Montana Territory like a blade of ice, whipping across the main street of Redemption Creek, with the kind of cold that made a man's bones ache just thinking about it. Jonas Merrick pulled his daughter closer against his side as they walked toward the center of town, her small hand tucked firmly inside his leather-gloved one. Even through the thick wool of her coat, he could feel her trembling, though whether from cold or excitement, he couldn't say. "Papa, do you think he'll really be there?" Ellie's voice was muffled by the scarf wrapped around her face, but Jonas could hear the hope threaded through every word. "Santa doesn't miss the Christmas festival, sweetheart," Jonas replied, his breath forming white clouds in the December air. "Been coming to Redemption Creek since before you were born." It was one of the few things that hadn't changed, one of the few traditions Jonas still allowed himself to keep, even after everything else had been stripped away. The town square had transformed overnight into something almost magical. Lanterns hung from every storefront, their warm glow pushing back against the gathering dusk. The smell of roasted chestnuts and cinnamon drifted through the air, mixing with wood smoke from the bonfire that crackled in the center of the square. Children ran between their parents' legs, shrieking with laughter, their cheeks flushed red from the cold and their eyes bright with anticipation. Jonas felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the one that came every year when he saw families moving through the festival together, complete and whole. Mothers straightening their children's scarves, fathers hoisting little ones onto their shoulders. Couples walking arm in arm, their heads bent together in conversation. He pushed the feeling down, buried it deep where it couldn't reach him. This day wasn't about his own quiet grief. It was about Ellie, about giving her something to remember beyond the emptiness that had settled over their ranch house like a second winter. "There!" Ellie suddenly yanked on his hand, pointing toward the far end of the square where a makeshift throne had been erected on a raised platform. "There's Santa, Papa! I see him!" Sure enough, there sat old Martin Grayson in his annual role, his genuine white beard requiring no enhancement, his round belly authentic from his wife's excellent cooking. The red suit might have been a bit threadbare in places, but to the children of Redemption Creek, he was as real as Christmas morning. A line of eager youngsters already snaked away from the platform, parents hovering nearby with indulgent smiles. Jonas felt Ellie tugging him forward with surprising strength for such a small thing. "Easy now," he murmured, but he let himself be pulled along. "He's not going anywhere." They took their place at the end of the line, and Jonas found himself studying his daughter's face as she stared ahead with single-minded focus. At 6 years old, Ellie Merrick was the perfect blend of him and her mother, his dark hair and serious eyes, but Sarah's delicate features and stubborn chin. Looking at her sometimes hurt more than Jonas could articulate, like staring directly into the sun until his eyes burned. The line moved slowly forward. Each child took their turn whispering secrets into Santa's ear, their faces solemn with the weight of their wishes. Jonas watched mothers and fathers exchange knowing glances, already mentally cataloging which requests could be fulfilled and which would require gentle explanation come Christmas morning. When it was finally Ellie's turn, she practically launched herself up the steps to the platform. Jonas started to follow, but she turned back with a look that stopped him in his tracks. "I need to talk to Santa by myself, Papa." But something in her voice, a maturity that shouldn't have belonged to a 6-year-old, made Jonas nod slowly. "All right, sweetheart, I'll be right here." He watched from the base of the platform as Ellie climbed onto Santa's lap with practiced ease. Martin Grayson's weathered face creased into a genuine smile as he looked down at her, one hand steadying her small frame. "Well, well, if it isn't Miss Ellie Merrick," the old man's voice carried clearly in the cold air. Have you been a good girl this year? Ellie nodded solemnly. I've tried real hard, Mr. Grayson. I mean, Santa. Jonas saw Martin's eyes twinkle with amusement. I'm sure you have, little one. Now, what can Santa bring you for Christmas? This was the moment Jonas had been both anticipating and dreading. The moment when Ellie would ask for something he couldn't give her, when the impossible would be requested with the absolute faith of childhood. He braced himself for the familiar requests. A doll, a pony, a music box like the one her mother used to have. But instead of speaking aloud, Ellie leaned close to Martin's ear, cupping her small hands around her mouth to create a private channel for her wish. Jonas saw her lips moving, saw the way her whole body seemed to lean into the secret she was sharing. And then he saw Martin Grayson's expression change. The old man's jovial smile faltered for just a moment. His eyes, sharp and knowing despite his years, flicked toward Jonas with something that looked uncomfortably like sympathy. Then he pulled back slightly to look at Ellie, and Jonas watched as Martin's gnarled hand came up to gently cup the child's cheek. That's a mighty big wish, sweetheart, Martin said softly, his voice barely carrying to where Jonas stood. But I'll tell you what, sometimes the very best gifts are the ones we don't see coming. You keep that heart of yours open, you hear me? Ellie nodded, her expression heartbreakingly serious. I will, Santa. I promise. When she climbed down and took Jonas's hand again, her face was unreadable, peaceful in a way that made Jonas's stomach clench with unease. Whatever she'd wished for, it clearly meant the world to her. What did you ask for, Ellie girl? Jonas tried to keep his voice casual as they moved away from the platform. It's a secret, Ellie replied, squeezing his hand. Santa says some wishes are private. Jonas opened his mouth to press further, then thought better of it. If she wanted to tell him, she would. That was how it had always been between them. He never forced her words, and she never held back when she was ready to share. They wandered through the festival, stopping to watch a puppet show near the general store and to listen to the church choir practice their Christmas hymns. Jonas bought Ellie a cup of hot cider and a gingerbread cookie shaped like a star, and for a while they simply stood near the bonfire, soaking in its warmth while the snow began to fall in earnest. It was as Jonas was finishing his own cup of cider that he noticed her. She stood near the entrance to the general store, a figure that seemed somehow separate from the bustle of the festival, despite being right in the middle of it. Tall and slender, wrapped in a deep green traveling coat that spoke of quality and care, she held herself with the kind of posture that suggested both confidence and caution. Her hair, a rich auburn that caught the lantern light, was pinned up beneath a practical hat, but a few rebellious strands had escaped to frame a face that was striking rather than conventionally pretty. But it was her eyes that caught Jonas's attention. Even from across the square, he could see they were sharp and assessing, taking in every detail of the town with the kind of careful observation that marked someone who'd learned to read situations quickly. They were the eyes of someone who'd seen things, perhaps more than she'd wanted to see. And then those eyes met his. The moment stretched between them, unexpected and somehow significant. Jonas felt something shift in his chest, not the tightness he'd grown accustomed to, but something else entirely, something that felt dangerously close to warmth. The woman held his gaze for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then her lips curved into the smallest of smiles, polite, distant, but not unkind, before she turned and disappeared into the general store. Papa, who's that lady? Jonas looked down to find Ellie watching him with those two knowing eyes, her gingerbread cookie forgotten in her hand. I don't know, sweetheart. Jonas cleared his throat, unsettled by how much he wanted to know the answer to that question. Must be someone new in town. She's pretty, Ellie observed with the straightforward honesty of childhood. Don't you think she's pretty, Papa? I suppose, Jonas replied carefully, steering them away from the general store toward the other side of the square. Come on. I think Mrs. Henderson has those ribbon candies you like. But even as they walked, even as he listened to Ellie chatter about the puppet show and the carols, part of Jonas's attention remained fixed on that moment of connection, on sharp eyes and auburn hair and the kind of smile that suggested both intelligence and wariness. He told himself it meant nothing, that it was simply the surprise of seeing a new face in town, the natural curiosity any man would feel. He told himself that the flutter in his chest was just the cold air catching in his lungs. He told himself a lot of things that December evening, standing in the falling snow while his daughter hummed Christmas hymns and the town celebrated around them. But Jonas Merrick had never been particularly good at lying, especially to himself. The festival wound down as darkness settled fully over Redemption Creek. Families began drifting toward home, children drooping with exhaustion, parents carrying the smallest ones. Jonas and Ellie lingered near the bonfire, neither quite ready to return to the ranch house that would feel all the emptier after the warmth and noise of the celebration. "Papa? Do you think Mama can see us right now?" Ellie's question was matter of fact, without the tremor of tears that such questions had carried in the first year after Sarah's death. Jonas looked down at his daughter, at the firelight dancing across her serious little face, and chose his words carefully. "I think if there's any way she can, she is. And I think she's glad we came to the festival tonight." Ellie nodded, satisfied with this answer. Then she leaned her head against his side, and Jonas wrapped his arm around her small shoulders, holding her close. "I miss her," Ellie said softly. "But not as much as I used to. Is that bad?" "No, sweetheart." Jonas's voice was rough. "That's not bad. That's just life finding a way forward." They stood together in the firelight, father and daughter, two people learning to carry their grief while still making room for moments of joy. Around them, the last of the festival goers called out their good nights, their voices carrying clear in the cold air. Jonas was just about to suggest they head for home when the door of the general store opened again, and the woman in the green coat emerged. She carried a package wrapped in brown paper, and she moved with the careful precision of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. This time, when their eyes met, Jonas found himself nodding in acknowledgement. The woman paused, seeming to weigh something in her mind, then returned the nod with that same small, careful smile. "Evening," Jonas called out, surprising himself. "Good evening." Her voice carried a hint of East Coast education, Boston maybe, or Philadelphia. Definitely not Montana territory. "Beautiful festival. Best one of the year," Jonas replied, aware of Ellie watching this exchange with keen interest. "New to Redemption Creek?" "I arrived on yesterday's stage." The woman adjusted her grip on her package. "I'm Clara Wynn, the new school teacher." The words landed with unexpected weight. Redemption Creek had been without a proper school teacher for nearly 8 months, ever since old Mr. Patterson had finally retired to live with his daughter in Denver. Jonas had been teaching Ellie himself from the few books they had at the ranch, but he knew it wasn't enough. "Jonas Merrick," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "This is my daughter, Ellie." "How do you do, Miss Ellie?" Clara Wynn's attention shifted to the little girl, and Jonas saw something in her expression soften slightly. "I'm very well, thank you." Ellie's manners kicked in automatically, the lessons Sarah had insisted upon still holding firm. "Are you really going to be our teacher?" "If all goes according to plan." Clara's smile became more genuine. "Though I'm told the schoolhouse needs some repairs before we can begin classes." "Papa's good at fixing things," Ellie offered before Jonas could respond. "He fixed our whole porch last summer." "Did he now?" Clara's eyes shifted back to Jonas, with a glimmer of what might have been amusement. "That's quite a useful skill in these parts, I imagine." "We make do," Jonas said, feeling oddly self-conscious under her steady gaze. "The schoolhouse needs work, it's true. Some of us men were planning to get together after Christmas, make it right before the new term." "That's very kind." Clara's formality had eased slightly, though she still held herself with that careful distance. "I appreciate the welcome." An awkward silence fell between them, filled with the crackling of the dying bonfire and the distant sound of someone's wagon rattling down the street. Jonas searched for something else to say, some way to extend this unexpected conversation, but the words tangled in his throat. It was Ellie who broke the silence. "Are you staying at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house?" "I am," Clara replied. "Very comfortable, though I'm still getting used to the cold. Boston winters are nothing compared to this." "Boston?" Ellie's eyes widened. "That's so far away. Why did you come all the way to Montana?" "Ellie," Jonas warned gently, but Clara held up a hand. "It's a fair question." She looked at Ellie with an expression Jonas couldn't quite read. "I wanted a fresh start, Miss Ellie. Sometimes people need to leave one place behind to find where they really belong. There was something in her voice, a carefully controlled emotion that suggested Clara Wynne had her own stories, her own griefs hidden beneath that polished exterior. Jonas recognized it because he carried the same weight himself. "Well," Jonas said when the silence threatened to stretch too long, "we should let you get back to Mrs. Henderson's before the snow gets worse. It was a pleasure meeting you, Miss Wynne." "The pleasure was mine, Mr. Merrick." "Miss Ellie." Clara nodded to them both, then turned to navigate the increasingly snow-covered street toward the boarding house. Jonas watched her go, noting the straight line of her back, the careful way she stepped over the patches of ice. She moved like someone who'd learned to be self-reliant, to trust only herself in a world that had perhaps proven untrustworthy. "I like her, Papa," Ellie announced once Clara was out of earshot. "You just met her, sweetheart." "I know." Ellie's hand found his again as they finally turned toward home. "But she's got kind eyes, like she understands things." Jonas didn't respond, but as they walked toward where he'd left their wagon, he found himself thinking about kind eyes and careful smiles, and the way a complete stranger could make something shift in a heart he'd thought was frozen solid. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, Ellie dozing against his side while Jonas guided their horse through the falling snow. The Merrick Ranch sat 5 miles outside of town, a modest spread that had been in Jonas's family for 2 generations. The house itself was solid, built by his father to withstand Montana winters, but it had felt cavernous and empty since Sarah's death. Jonas had tried to fill it with work, with the endless demands of running a ranch single-handed while caring for a young daughter. He tried to make it feel like home again, but some nights when he sat by the fire after tucking Ellie into bed, he could hear the silence pressing in from all sides, reminding him of everything he'd lost. Tonight, though, as he carried a sleeping Ellie inside and laid her gently in her bed, something felt different. There was a flutter of something in his chest that he hadn't felt in 3 long years, something that felt dangerously close to possibility. He stood in Ellie's doorway for a long moment, watching her sleep, thinking about Christmas wishes and new school teachers and the way a single conversation could crack open a door he'd thought he'd sealed shut forever. "What did you wish for, Ellie girl?" he whispered into the darkness. "What secret did you tell Santa?" But his daughter slept on, her face peaceful, her hand tucked under her cheek the way Sarah used to sleep. Jonas moved to his own room, the larger bedroom he'd shared with his wife, and stood at the window looking out over the snow-covered valley. Somewhere out there, in the warm safety of Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, Clara Wynne was likely settling in for the night, unpacking her life in a strange new town. He wondered what had driven her here, what kind of fresh start she was seeking, what sorrows or disappointments had pushed her to travel halfway across the country to a rough Montana town where winters could kill and summers could parch. He wondered, and then he forced himself to stop wondering, because wondering led to hoping, and hoping led to wanting, and wanting things he couldn't have had brought Jonas Merrick nothing but pain. Better to keep his head down, his heart closed, his focus on the only thing that mattered, raising his daughter and keeping their small family of 2 moving forward through the seasons. But even as he told himself these familiar truths, even as he climbed into bed and pulled the quilts up against the cold, Jonas couldn't quite shake the memory of sharp eyes meeting his across a snowy town square. He couldn't quite forget the way his heart had responded to that single, careful smile. And somewhere in the house, tucked safe in her bed, Ellie Merrick slept with a secret wish folded close to her heart, a wish that would change everything, if only her father could find the courage to let it. The snow fell steadily through the night, blanketing Redemption Creek and the surrounding valley in a fresh layer of white. It covered the festival grounds, silencing the last echoes of celebration. It gathered on windowsills and doorsteps, promising a cold but beautiful Christmas morning. And in 3 different places, a ranch house on the valley's edge, a room in Mrs. Henderson's boarding house, and the private thoughts of a man who'd forgotten how to hope, the seeds of something new had been planted, something that would grow despite the cold, something that would bloom despite the frost, something that started with a little girl's whispered wish and a stranger's careful smile in the falling snow. The morning after the Christmas festival dawned clear and brutally cold, the kind of cold that made every breath visible and turned the moisture in a man's beard to ice. Jonas was up before sunrise, as always, moving through the morning chores with practiced efficiency. He fed the horses, checked the cattle in the near pasture, and split enough wood to keep the stove burning through another frigid day. Ellie appeared in the kitchen doorway just as he was frying eggs, her dark hair wild from sleep, still wearing the nightgown Sarah had sewn for her 2 Christmases ago. The hem was getting short now. His daughter was growing faster than he could quite believe. "Morning, Papa," she said, climbing into her chair at the table. "Morning, sweetheart. Sleep well?" "Uh-huh." Ellie watched him dish eggs onto their plates with the quiet attention she gave everything. "Papa, do you think Miss Wynne knows how to ice skate?" Jonas paused with the spatula halfway to her plate. "I have no idea. Why do you ask?" "Just wondering." Ellie's tone was too casual, the way it got when she was working up to something. "Miller's Pond is probably frozen solid by now. We could go skating this week." "We could," Jonas agreed carefully, setting her plate in front of her. "But what does that have to do with Miss Wynne?" "Nothing." Ellie picked up her fork with exaggerated innocence. "I just thought it would be nice to invite her, since she's new and probably doesn't know many people yet." Jonas sat down across from his daughter, studying her face. At 6 years old, she had a transparency that adults had long since learned to mask, but right now he could see the wheels turning behind those serious dark eyes. "Ellie, what's going on in that head of yours?" "Nothing, Papa. I just think we should be friendly. That's what Mama would have done, isn't it, when someone new came to town?" The invocation of Sarah was deliberate, and they both knew it. Jonas sighed, reaching for his coffee. "Yes, that's what your Mama would have done. But Miss Wynne is settling in. She probably has plenty to keep her busy without us underfoot." "We wouldn't be underfoot," Ellie protested. "We'd be helpful. You said the schoolhouse needs fixing, right? Maybe we could start on that this week instead of waiting until after Christmas." Jonas looked at his daughter over the rim of his coffee cup, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw. That was pure Sarah, too. Once his wife had gotten an idea in her head, there was no shifting it until she'd seen it through. "Eat your breakfast," he said finally. "We'll see." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either, and Ellie's satisfied smile told him she knew exactly which way the wind was blowing. 3 days later, Jonas found himself driving the wagon back into Redemption Creek with a load of lumber and tools, Ellie bundled up beside him, chattering about everything and nothing. He told himself he was doing this purely for practical reasons. The schoolhouse did need repairs, and there was no sense waiting when the weather was clear enough to work. The fact that the new schoolteacher might appreciate the gesture was entirely secondary. He told himself that lie approximately 17 times on the drive into town. The schoolhouse sat on the north edge of Redemption Creek, a simple wooden structure that had seen better days. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. Several windows had cracks that would let in the winter wind, and the front steps were rotted through in places. Jonas pulled the wagon up alongside the building and set the brake, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done first. "Can I go find Miss Wynne, Papa?" Ellie was already climbing down before he could answer. "Stay where I can see you," Jonas called after her, but she was already running toward the center of town, her braids flying behind her. He shook his head and began unloading lumber, telling himself he was not disappointed that Clara Wynne hadn't happened to be at the schoolhouse already. Of course she wouldn't be. She had no way of knowing he'd be here, and she likely had her own business to attend to. Jonas had just started examining the rotted steps when he heard voices approaching. Ellie's bright chatter, and then another voice, cultured, measured, distinctly Eastern. "And Papa brought all the wood and everything. He says we can fix it up real nice before Christmas." "That's very ambitious," Clara Wynne replied, amusement coloring her tone. "These repairs look quite extensive." Jonas straightened up, wiping his hands on his work pants, and turned to find Ellie towing Clara toward the schoolhouse, like a prize she'd won at the fair. The teacher wore a practical dark blue dress today, a heavy shawl wrapped around her shoulders, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe knot. But her eyes, those sharp, assessing eyes, were warm as they looked at his daughter. Then they shifted to Jonas, and he saw something flicker there. Surprise, perhaps? Or maybe the same uneasy awareness that had been dogging him since the festival. "Mr. Merrick," Clara said, stopping a polite distance away. "This is unexpected." "Miss Wynne," Jonas touched his hat brim. Figured there was no sense waiting to get started on the repairs. Weather's clear enough to work, and Ellie's been after me to do something useful with our time." "I see." Clara's lips curved slightly. "And are you always so easily influenced by a 6-year-old?" "When she makes good sense, usually." Jonas found himself almost smiling back. "Though I try not to let her know that." "Too late, Papa," Ellie announced cheerfully. "I already know," Clara laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her careful features into something almost luminous. Jonas felt that same flutter in his chest, that dangerous warmth that had no business being there. "Well then," Clara said, moving closer to examine the schoolhouse, "what's the damage?" For the next hour, Jonas walked her through what needed doing: the roof repairs, the window replacements, the complete reconstruction of the front steps. Clara listened with focused attention, asking intelligent questions about materials and timelines. She had clearly never swung a hammer in her life, but she understood structural problems with a precision that surprised him. "I apologize for the condition of the building," she said as they stood looking up at the sagging roofline. "In my correspondence with the town council, I was led to believe the schoolhouse was, well, less derelict." "It's been a hard few years," Jonas replied. "We lost Mr. Patterson, and folks have been scrambling just to keep their own places running. The school sort of fell through the cracks." "I understand." Clara's voice carried no judgment, only acceptance. "It happens everywhere, not just in Montana. People do the best they can with what they have." There was something in the way she said it, a weariness that spoke of personal experience. Jonas found himself curious again about what had brought her here, what she was running from, or running toward. "Miss Wynne, watch this," Ellie called from where she'd been exploring the schoolyard. She'd found a patch of ice and was sliding across it with abandon, her arms windmilling for balance. "Careful, sweetheart," Jonas called, but Clara was already moving toward his daughter with surprising speed. "Keep your knees bent," Clara instructed, demonstrating with her own posture. "And spread your arms out to the sides for better balance. Like this." To Jonas's amazement, Clara stepped onto the ice herself, gliding across it with practiced grace. Her severe expression had given way to something younger, lighter, as she spun in a small circle and came to a neat stop. "You can skate!" Ellie's face was pure delight. "I grew up near the Charles River," Clara replied, a bit breathlessly. "We skated every winter. I haven't done it in years, but I suppose it's like riding a bicycle. The body remembers." "Will you teach me to spin like that?" Ellie was already trying to mimic Clara's movements, with considerably less success. "If we can find you some proper skates, certainly." Clara offered her hand to steady Ellie. "Though I suspect the ponds here freeze quite a bit harder than the ones in Boston." Jonas watched them together, his serious daughter and this unexpected teacher, and felt something in his chest crack open just a fraction wider. He'd been so focused on keeping Ellie safe, on maintaining the tight circle of their grief, that he'd forgotten she needed more than just him. She needed other voices, other perspectives. She needed people who could teach her things he couldn't. She needed, though he was only beginning to admit it, a woman's influence in her life. "Mr. Merrick?" Jonas realized Clara was looking at him expectantly, and he'd completely missed whatever she'd said. "Sorry, wool gathering," he said. "What was that?" "I was asking if you'd like some help with the repairs. I can't hammer or saw, but I can hold things steady or hand you tools or whatever else might be useful." Jonas's first instinct was to refuse. He'd been working alone for 3 years now, had gotten good at managing everything himself. But something in Clara's expression stopped him. She wasn't offering out of pity or obligation. She was offering because she wanted to contribute, because sitting idle while others worked wasn't in her nature. "That'd be appreciated," Jonas heard himself say. "If you're sure you don't mind getting your dress dirty, Mr. Merrick, I just traveled 3 days on a stagecoach through December in Montana territory. I assure you my dress has survived worse than a little sawdust." They fell into an easy rhythm after that. Jonas worked on replacing the rotted steps while Clara held board steady and Ellie entertained herself exploring the schoolyard. They didn't talk much at first, both of them focused on the task at hand, but gradually conversation began to flow. "How long have you been ranching?" Clara asked, handing him another board. "All my life. My father built the place when he first came to Montana, passed it to me when I was 22. "That's young to take on such responsibility." Jonas shrugged, measuring the board before cutting. Not so young out here. Most folks grow up fast in the territory. Have to. Claire was quiet for a moment, holding the board steady while he hammered. Then she said, Ellie mentioned her mother passed away. I hope I'm not overstepping. The familiar tightness returned to Jonas's chest, but it wasn't as sharp as it usually was. Maybe because Clara's tone held no pity, only gentle acknowledgement. 3 years ago, fever took her in the spring. He focused on the hammering, on the precise placement of each nail. Ellie was only 3, barely remembers her now. I'm sorry. Clara's voice was soft. That must have been terribly difficult. It was. Jonas set down the hammer, testing the board's stability. Still is some days, but we manage. You do more than manage, Clara said. Ellie is a remarkable child. Well-mannered, curious, kind. That doesn't happen by accident. The compliment caught Jonas off guard, warming him in a way that had nothing to do with the physical work. She's a good girl. Takes after her mother in the ways that matter. They worked in companionable silence for a while longer, the sound of hammering punctuated by Ellie's occasional exclamations of discovery from the schoolyard. Jonas found himself hyper-aware of Clara's presence beside him. The efficient way she moved, the quick intelligence in her eyes as she anticipated what he'd need next, the faint scent of lavender that clung to her despite the cold. What about you? He asked, surprising himself. What brings a Boston school teacher to Montana territory? Clara's hand stilled on the board she was holding. For a moment, Jonas thought she wouldn't answer, that he'd overstepped the boundaries of their brief acquaintance. But then she spoke, her voice measured and controlled. I was engaged to be married. A lawyer in Boston, very respectable, very ambitious. She paused, and Jonas waited. I discovered 3 months before the wedding that he'd been courting another woman the entire time, someone with better family connections and a larger dowry. Jonas felt a surge of anger on her behalf. That's humiliating? Clara supplied, her tone dry. Yes, it was, but also clarifying. I realized I'd been living the life everyone expected of me, rather than the one I wanted. So I broke the engagement, sold what jewelry I had, and answered an advertisement for a teaching position in Montana. That took courage, Jonas said quietly, or desperation. Clara's smile was self-deprecating. I'm not sure which. Maybe both. Sometimes they're the same thing. Clara looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jonas felt the full force of her intelligence and perception. She saw more than most people, he realized. She understood things that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Yes, she said softly. Sometimes they are. The moment stretched between them, charged with an understanding that went deeper than their brief acquaintance should have allowed. Jonas found himself wanting to tell her things, about Sarah, about the loneliness of the ranch house, about the fear that he was failing Ellie by keeping her so isolated from the world. But before he could find the words, Ellie came running over, her face flushed with cold and excitement. Papa, Miss Wynne, come look what I found. She dragged them to the far corner of the schoolyard where, half buried in snow and dead grass, an old swing set stood. The ropes were frayed and rotted, the seat itself cracked and dangerous, but Ellie looked at it like she'd discovered buried treasure. Can you fix it, Papa? Please? The school needs a swing. Jonas examined the structure, noting the rusted chains and unstable frame. It's pretty far gone, sweetheart. Might be better to build a new one come spring. I could help, Clara offered. My father had a swing in our garden when I was young. I remember how it was constructed. You want to help build a swing set? Jonas couldn't quite keep the surprise from his voice. Clara's chin came up slightly, a hint of defiance in her eyes. Is there a reason I shouldn't? No, I just... Jonas stopped, recognizing he was about to step in something he couldn't easily step out of. No reason at all. Spring it is, then. Ellie cheered, throwing her arms around both of them in an exuberant hug that caught Jonas and Clara equally off guard. For a moment they were frozen there, an accidental family tableau in the snow, before Ellie released them and ran off to explore something else. Clara stepped back quickly, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. I apologize. She's very enthusiastic. That's one word for it, Jonas agreed, his own face warm despite the cold. They returned to work on the steps, but something had shifted. The air between them felt charged now, full of possibilities neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. Jonas found his awareness of her intensifying, the way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she concentrated, the small crease that appeared between her eyebrows when she was thinking, the grace of her movements despite the awkwardness of the work. By the time the sun began its descent toward the horizon, they'd accomplished more than Jonas had hoped. The front steps were completely rebuilt, solid and safe. The worst of the window cracks had been temporarily sealed, and he'd assessed exactly what would be needed for the roof repairs. "We should head back before it gets full dark," Jonas said, gathering his tools. "These roads aren't safe once the sun goes down." "Of course." Clara brushed sawdust from her dress with limited success. "Thank you for doing this, Mr. Merrick. You didn't have to." "Jonas," he heard himself say, "we're going to be working together on this building for a while. Might as well be on first-name terms." Clara hesitated, then nodded. "Clara, then, and you're right. We'll be seeing quite a lot of each other, I suspect." The thought sent a warm flutter through Jonas's chest that he firmly told himself was nothing more than anticipation of getting the schoolhouse finished. He loaded Ellie into the wagon, but before he could climb up himself, Clara called out to him. "Jonas?" She stood in the schoolyard, wrapped in her shawl, looking somehow both vulnerable and strong in the fading light. "Would you—" "That is, Ellie mentioned something about ice skating on Miller's Pond." Jonas's heart did an unexpected somersault. "She did she? I hope she wasn't speaking out of turn, but I wondered if perhaps, if you were planning to go, if I might join you. I haven't skated in so long, and She trailed off, and for the first time since he'd met her, Clara looked uncertain. "I'm afraid I don't know many people yet, and the solitude is sometimes—" "We'd be glad to have you," Jonas interrupted before she could finish, before he could second-guess the invitation. "Day after tomorrow? Weather permitting?" Clara's smile was like sunrise, slow, warm, and absolutely transforming. "I'd like that very much." As they drove away, Ellie pressed against his side despite the cold. Jonas found himself actually looking forward to something for the first time in 3 years, not just enduring the days as they came, but actually anticipating what lay ahead. "You like her, don't you, Papa?" Ellie's voice was muffled against his coat. "She seems like a fine teacher," Jonas replied carefully. "That's not what I meant." Jonas sighed, knowing there was no fooling his perceptive daughter. "She seems like a fine person, Ellie. That's all." But as they drove through the gathering darkness, passing houses with lamplight glowing warm in the windows, Jonas knew it was more than that. Clara Wynne had walked into his carefully controlled world and cracked something open, something he'd thought was sealed shut forever. The question was whether he had the courage to let it open further, or whether fear would win out the way it had for 3 long years. The day of the ice skating arrived clear and cold, the kind of perfect winter day that made Montana Territory look like something from a painting. Jonas spent the morning doing ranch work, trying not to think about the afternoon, trying not to examine too closely why his hands were unsteady as he hitched the horses to the wagon. Ellie had been up since dawn, too excited to sleep, pestering him about what time they were leaving and whether Miss Wynne would really come, and if she remembered how to skate after all these years. Jonas had finally sent her to polish the ice skates, the old ones that had been Sarah's and the small pair he'd carved for Ellie 2 winters ago, just to give her something to do besides asking questions he couldn't answer. They collected Clara from the boarding house at noon. She emerged wearing a dark red coat Jonas hadn't seen before, practical boots, and a wool hat that brought out the copper highlights in her auburn hair. She carried her own skates, good quality ones that had clearly seen many winters of use. "I wasn't sure they'd still fit," she confessed as Jonas helped her into the wagon. "I haven't worn them since before I left Boston." "Only one way to find out," Jonas replied, acutely conscious of how her hand felt in his, even through their gloves. Miller's Pond sat about 2 miles outside of town, a natural depression fed by a spring that created a perfect skating surface each winter. When they arrived, they found several other families already there, the Hendersons with their brood of 4, the Walkers, and old Dutch Schmidt, who came every winter to demonstrate the skating techniques he'd learned as a boy in Amsterdam. Ellie was out of the wagon before Jonas had fully stopped, calling greetings to the other children. Jonas helped Clara down, trying to ignore the way his pulse quickened at her nearness. "It's beautiful," Claire said, looking out at the frozen pond surrounded by snow-dusted pines, like something from a winter fairy tale. Wait until you're out on the ice, Jonas replied. Then it's less fairy tale and more survival. But Clara just laughed, that same genuine sound that transformed her whole face. I'll risk it. They laced up their skates on a fallen log at the pond's edge. Jonas's own skates were ancient, his father's originally, but still serviceable. He got Ellie settled first, making sure her small skates were tight enough to provide support, then helped Clara with a buckle that had frozen. There's a trick to these old ones, he said, working the stiff leather. You have to warm them first, Clara finished. I remember. My father taught me that. Their eyes met, and Jonas became suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, how his hands were still on her skate, how her face was tilted up toward his. He cleared his throat and stepped back. That should hold, he said, his voice rougher than intended. The ice was perfect, smooth and solid, with just enough texture to provide grip. Ellie took off immediately, her technique more enthusiasm than skill, but she stayed upright, and that was what mattered. Jonas glided out after her, his body remembering rhythms it hadn't practiced in years. And then Clara joined them, and Jonas forgot about everything else. She moved across the ice like music given form, graceful, confident, completely at home. She'd clearly been an accomplished skater in her youth, and muscle memory took over despite the years away. She swept past him in a wide arc, her coat flaring out behind her, her face alight with pure joy. You didn't mention you were an expert, Jonas called out, skating after her. I'm rusty, Clara protested, but she was smiling. Give me a few minutes and I'll probably fall flat on my face. She didn't fall. If anything, she grew more confident as she warmed up, attempting spins and turns that drew appreciative comments from the other skaters. Ellie was mesmerized, following Clara around the pond like a devoted pupil, trying to copy her movements. Jonas contented himself with simply watching them, his daughter, and this unexpected woman who'd entered their lives just days ago. He saw how patient Clara was with Ellie's questions, how she broke down complex movements into simple steps a 6-year-old could manage. He saw how she encouraged without coddling, pushed without overwhelming. He saw how Ellie bloomed under that attention, growing bolder and more confident with each circuit around the pond. She's a natural teacher, isn't she? Jonas turned to find Martha Henderson skating up beside him, her round face pink from cold and exertion. Seems to be, Jonas agreed. Good thing, too. This town's needed a proper school for far too long. Martha paused, then added with studied casualness, She's pretty, too. And single, I understand. Jonas gave his neighbor a warning look. Martha, I'm just saying. Martha held up her hands in mock surrender. It's been 3 years, Jonas. Sarah wouldn't want you to be alone forever. I'm not alone. I have Ellie. That's not the same thing, and you know it. Martha's voice gentled. That little girl needs a mother. And you need... What I need, Jonas interrupted firmly, is to keep focused on getting through each day. That's all I can handle right now. But even as he said it, his eyes tracked back to Clara, who was showing Ellie how to skate backwards. And Martha, damn her, noticed. Uh-huh, she said knowingly. Just getting through each day, that's all. She skated away before Jonas could respond, leaving him alone with thoughts he didn't want to examine too closely. The afternoon wore on. The sun hung low in the winter sky, painting everything gold and pink. One by one, families began packing up, heading home before the temperature dropped with nightfall. But Jonas found himself reluctant to leave, reluctant to break the spell of this perfect day. Ellie, exhausted from hours of skating, had fallen asleep wrapped in blankets in the wagon. Clara sat beside Jonas on the fallen log, unlacing her skates, her cheeks flushed from exercise and cold. Thank you for inviting me, she said quietly. I can't remember the last time I enjoyed myself so much. Thank Ellie. It was her idea. Jonas worked on his own skates, focusing on the buckles to avoid looking at Clara's face. Was it really? Clara's tone suggested she wasn't fooled. Well, thank you for agreeing to it then. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the only sounds the distant voices of the last families leaving and the whisper of wind through the pines. Jonas, Clara said finally, can I ask you something? Depends on what it is. Why didn't you remarry? In 3 years, surely there must have been women who... She stopped, seeming to realize she'd overstepped. I'm sorry. That's far too personal. Jonas should have agreed, should have shut down the conversation. Instead, he found himself answering with an honesty that surprised him. Because I was scared, he said simply. Scared of losing someone again. Scared of letting Ellie get attached and then having that person leave. Scared that what Sarah and I had was the only chance I'd ever get at that kind of love, and anything else would just be settling. Clara was quiet, absorbing this. Then she said, That's not living, though. That's just existing. There's a difference. Is there? Jonas finally looked at her, found her watching him with those sharp, understanding eyes. Seems to me existing is safer. Less chance of getting your heart torn out again. Safer, yes, but also lonelier. Clara held his gaze. Trust me, I know. I spent 2 years after my engagement ended telling myself I was better off alone, that trusting someone again would just lead to more pain. But then I realized I was so busy protecting myself that I'd stopped actually living my life. So you came to Montana. So I came to Montana, Clara confirmed. To teach, yes, but also to remember how to be open to possibilities, to stop letting fear make all my decisions for me. Jonas wanted to argue, wanted to defend his careful control, his protective walls. But sitting there in the fading light, watching Clara's face, he couldn't quite find the words. Fear isn't the same as being broken, Clara said softly. It's just fear, and we can choose whether to let it rule us or whether to push past it. Before Jonas could respond, Ellie's sleepy voice called from the wagon. Papa, are we going home now? The moment broke. Jonas stood, offering his hand to help Clara up. She took it, and for just a second, neither of them let go. They stood there, hands clasped, something unspoken flowing between them. Then Clara squeezed gently and released him, moving to gather her things. Jonas watched her, his mind spinning, his carefully constructed defenses cracking wider with every moment he spent in her presence. The drive back to town was quiet, Ellie dozing between them, the horses finding their own way through familiar roads. When they reached the boarding house, Jonas helped Clara down, acutely aware of how natural it felt to have his hands on her waist, how right it seemed to have her close. Same time tomorrow? The words were out before Jonas could stop them. For working on the schoolhouse, I mean. Clara smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. I'd like that. Very much. She went inside and Jonas climbed back into the wagon, his heart pounding like he'd run a mile. Ellie stirred, blinking up at him sleepily. Papa? Yes, sweetheart? I think my Christmas wish might be coming true. Jonas looked down at his daughter, at her peaceful, knowing smile, and felt something shift in his chest, something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Maybe so, Ellie girl, he whispered. Maybe so. The days leading up to Christmas fell into a rhythm that Jonas hadn't experienced in 3 years, a rhythm that included more than just survival and solitude. Each morning he'd complete the ranch work, then drive into town with Ellie to continue repairs on the schoolhouse. And each day, Clara would be there waiting, her sleeves rolled up despite the cold, ready to help in whatever way she could. They worked well together, Jonas discovered. Clara had a quick mind that grasped structural problems intuitively, and though she lacked physical strength, she made up for it with clever solutions and tireless determination. She also had a way of making even tedious work feel lighter, filling the hours with stories from her Boston childhood and questions about life in Montana territory. Tell me about the ranch, she said one afternoon as they replaced a section of damaged roofing. Jonas was balanced on a ladder while Clara handed up supplies from below. Ellie mentioned you have cattle. Some, Jonas replied, hammering a shingle into place. Not as many as we used to. Had to sell off a good portion of the herd after Sarah died. Couldn't manage the full spread alone. That must have been difficult. It was necessary. Jonas reached for another shingle. Ranch that size needs at least 3 working men. I had to make choices. Clara was quiet for a moment, then said, Do you ever think about expanding again? Now that Ellie's older and you've had time to establish routines? Jonas paused in his hammering, considering the question. The truth was, he'd been so focused on simply maintaining what he had that he'd stopped thinking about growth, about future possibilities. His world had contracted to the size of his grief, and he'd accepted that contraction as permanent. Haven't thought much about it, he admitted. Seemed easier to just keep things manageable. Manageable, Claire repeated thoughtfully. Or safe? Jonas looked down at her, found her gazing up with that penetrating intelligence that seemed to see straight through his careful defenses. Maybe both. There's nothing wrong with being cautious, Clara said, but there's a difference between caution and just stopping, letting fear freeze you in place. You think that's what I've done? I think, Clara said carefully, that you've been protecting yourself and Ellie the best way you knew how, but I also think maybe it's time to consider whether those protections are still serving you or whether they're keeping you from living fully. Before Jonas could respond, Ellie came running around the corner of the schoolhouse, her face flushed with excitement. Papa! Miss Wynne! Mr. Henderson says there's a barn fire at the Peterson place. He's gathering men to help. Jonas was down the ladder in seconds, his heart pounding. Barn fires in winter were deadly serious, not just for the building but for any animals trapped inside, and for the surrounding structures that could catch if the wind was wrong. Stay with Miss Wynne, he ordered Ellie, already moving toward where he'd left the wagon. Jonas, wait. Clara caught his arm. How far is the Peterson place? About 3 miles west. Why? Take me with you. I can help. Jonas shook his head automatically. It's dangerous. The smoke alone. I'm not fragile, Clara interrupted, her voice firm. And an extra pair of hands could make a difference. You said yourself ranches like these need multiple people. Well, you have one available. Use her. Jonas looked at her, this Boston schoolteacher in her practical dress and determined expression, and made a split-second decision that went against every protective instinct he had. Get in the wagon. Ellie, go to Mrs. Henderson. Stay with her until I come back. They raced towards the Peterson ranch, Jonas pushing the horses harder than he normally would. Beside him, Clara gripped the wagon seat, her face pale but set with determination. In the distance, they could already see the smoke, a thick black column rising against the gray winter sky. Clara, Jonas said as they approached, when we get there, you do exactly what I say. No arguments. Understood? Understood. The scene at the Peterson ranch was controlled chaos. The barn was fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof, the heat intense even from a distance. A bucket brigade had already formed from the well to the barn, though everyone knew it was futile. The building was lost. The goal now was to keep the fire from spreading to the house and other outbuildings. Jonas spotted Dave Peterson near the barn entrance, his face blackened with soot, and his heart sank. Dave was a good man, a hard worker, but he had a tendency to take foolish risks. The horses! Dave was shouting. There are still 3 horses inside. I can hear them. Jonas could hear them too, terrified whinnies cutting through the roar of the flames. Without thinking, he started toward the barn, but Clara grabbed his arm. Jonas, no! It's suicide! Those horses are worth more than everything else Dave owns put together. Without them, he can't work the ranch. He'll lose everything. Jonas looked at her, saw the fear in her eyes, and felt his heart crack a little wider. I have to try. He expected her to argue, to try to stop him. Instead, Clara's jaw set with determination. Then I'm coming with you. You'll need someone to lead the horses out while you free them. Absolutely not. We're wasting time arguing, Clara said, already moving toward the well. She soaked her shawl in water, wrapped it around her nose and mouth, then looked at him with eyes that blazed brighter than the fire. Are we doing this or not? Jonas had about 3 seconds to make a decision. He could waste precious time arguing with this stubborn, brave, impossibly courageous woman, or he could trust her to know her own capabilities. He chose trust. Stay low, he commanded, soaking his own bandana. The smoke rises. If it gets too thick, get out immediately. Don't be a hero. Says the man running into a burning barn, Clara shot back, but there was something in her voice, fear mixed with admiration, that made Jonas's chest tighten. They entered the barn together, crouching low as Jonas had instructed. The heat was overwhelming, the smoke thick and choking despite their makeshift masks. Jonas could barely see 3 feet in front of him, but he knew this barn's layout. He'd helped Dave build it 5 years ago. This way! He shouted over the roar of flames, grabbing Clara's hand to pull her toward the stalls. The horses were in the back corner, thank God, where the fire hadn't reached yet. But it was spreading fast, eating through the dry wood like kindling. Jonas could hear the structure groaning, could see flames licking across the ceiling beams. "We have maybe 2 minutes before this whole thing comes down," he shouted to Clara. The first horse, a gray mare, was wild with panic, her eyes rolling white. Jonas managed to get a rope around her neck, but she reared, nearly striking Clara with her hooves. "Easy, girl." Clara's voice cut through the chaos, surprisingly steady. She moved closer to the horse, one hand extended, speaking in low, soothing tones that Jonas could barely hear. "Easy now. We're here to help. That's it. Good girl." Impossibly, the mare began to calm. Clara kept talking, kept that hand extended, and the horse lowered her head, trembling but manageable. "Lead her out," Jonas commanded. "Straight through the main door. Don't stop for anything." Clara nodded and took the rope, moving with the mare toward the entrance. Jonas turned to the second horse, a young gelding who was kicking at his stall door with enough force to splinter the wood. A beam crashed down 10 feet away, sending up a shower of sparks. The gelding screamed, and Jonas knew he had seconds, maybe less. He threw open the stall door and dodged a flying hoof as the horse bolted past him toward the entrance. That left one more. Dave's best stallion, the one he used for breeding. Jonas could see him in the far stall, but between them, the fire had spread across the floor. There was no clear path. "Jonas!" Clara's voice behind him. She'd come back. "Get out of here. It's going to collapse. One more horse. Then move." Together they dodged through patches of flame, Clara staying low while Jonas shielded her as best he could with his body. They reached the stallion's stall just as another beam fell, this one close enough that Jonas felt the heat singe his coat. The stallion was the calmest of the three, strangely enough. Maybe he trusted humans more, or maybe he'd simply accepted his fate. Jonas got a rope around him easily, but when he tried to lead him out, the horse balked at the flames blocking their path. "He won't go through," Jonas shouted. Clara was beside the horse in an instant, her hand on his neck, her voice in his ear. Jonas couldn't hear what she was saying, but whatever it was, it worked. The stallion lowered his head, and Clara began to lead him forward. They made it halfway to the door when the roof began to give way. Jonas heard the groan of wood, saw the way the remaining beams bowed inward, and knew they had maybe 3 seconds. He grabbed Clara around the waist with one arm, kept his grip on the stallion's rope with the other, and ran. They burst through the barn door just as the roof collapsed behind them with a sound like thunder. The force of the implosion sent them sprawling into the snow, the stallion rearing and yanking the rope from Jonas's hands as he fled toward the safety of the pasture. For a long moment, Jonas just lay there in the snow, his lungs burning, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might break through his chest. Then he became aware of Clara beneath him, where he'd instinctively shielded her from the falling debris. "Clara," his voice was raw from smoke. "Clara, are you hurt?" She coughed, her whole body shaking, but when she spoke her voice was steady. "I'm fine. You?" Jonas pushed himself up, checking her over with frantic hands even as she protested. Her face was blackened with soot, her dress singed in places, but she appeared uninjured. Relief flooded through him so intense it was almost painful. "You crazy, brave, impossible woman," he said, his hands framing her face. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Clara replied, her own hands coming up to grip his wrists. "But we weren't. We saved them, Jonas, all 3 horses." Around them, the bucket brigade had given up on the barn and was focusing on keeping the nearby structures wet. Dave Peterson was checking over his horses, tears streaming down his sooty face. Someone was cheering, but Jonas barely noticed any of it. All he could see was Clara, soot-stained and magnificent, her eyes bright with adrenaline and triumph, her face tilted up toward his. "You were incredible in there," he said quietly, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, unable to stop touching her, to confirm she was real and whole and safe. "The way you handled those horses, the way you stayed calm." "I was terrified," Clara admitted. "But you needed help, and I wasn't going to let you go in there alone." "Why?" The question came out rougher than Jonas intended. "Why would you risk yourself like that? You barely know me, barely know this town." "Because it mattered," Clara said simply. "Because you mattered. Because sometimes the right thing to do is scary, and we do it anyway." Jonas became suddenly aware of how close they were, how his hands still cradled her face, how her fingers still gripped his wrists. how the entire town was probably watching them. He should pull away, should step back, should remember all the reasons this was complicated and dangerous and too fast. Instead, he found himself leaning closer. "Jonas," Clara whispered, her eyes searching his face. "Tell me to stop," he said, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the dying fire. "Tell me this is too soon, too much, and I'll step back." Claire's hand slid from his wrist to his face, mirroring his own gesture. "I don't want you to stop." He kissed her there in the snow, surrounded by smoke and chaos, in front of half the town. It was gentle and fierce all at once, tasting of soot and desperation, and something that felt terrifyingly like hope. Clara kissed him back with equal intensity, her fingers threading through his hair, and Jonas felt 3 years of carefully constructed walls crumble to dust. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against hers. "I'm scared," he admitted. "Terrified, actually. Of this, of what it means, of losing someone again." "I know," Clara said softly. "I'm scared too. But Jonas, fear isn't the same as being broken. It's just fear. And we get to choose whether it rules us or whether we push past it." Her own words spoken back to him. Jonas let out a shaky laugh. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise," Clara replied, a smile in her voice. "You just weren't paying attention." Someone cleared their throat loudly, and Jonas looked up to find Dave Peterson standing a few feet away, grinning despite the destruction of his barn. "Don't mean to interrupt," Dave said, his eyes twinkling, "but I figure I owe you to a debt I can never repay. Those horses, Jonas, you know what they mean to my operation." "Just glad we got them out," Jonas replied, finally stepping back from Clara, though he kept hold of her hand. "How's the house?" "Untouched, thanks to the bucket brigade. We'll rebuild the barn come spring." Dave's grin widened. "And it looks like you might be rebuilding a few things yourself." Jonas felt heat rise to his face that had nothing to do with the fire. Clara squeezed his hand, and when he looked at her, she was smiling too, a bit embarrassed but not ashamed. The ride back to town was quiet, both of them processing what had happened, both the fire and what had happened between them. Jonas's hands were steady on the reins, but inside, his emotions were in turmoil. 3 years of grief and fear and careful control, and one brave woman had broken through all of it in the space of weeks. "Jonas," Clara said as they approached town, "what happens now?" It was a fair question. They'd crossed a line back there in the snow, and there was no uncrossing it. The whole town would be talking by nightfall. Ellie would have questions. Everything would change. "I don't know," Jonas admitted. "I haven't thought past keeping you alive for the next 5 minutes." Clara laughed, and the sound loosened something in Jonas's chest. "Well, I'm alive. So what now?" Jonas pulled the wagon to a stop just outside town, turning to face her fully. In the fading afternoon light, with soot still smudging her face and her hair coming loose from its pins, Clara Wynne was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "Now I ask if I can court you properly," he said. "If you're willing to take a chance on a widowed rancher with a young daughter and more fear than sense." "I think," Clara said carefully, "that the question is whether you're willing to take a chance on a stubborn schoolteacher from Boston who has her own share of fears and complications." "Is that a yes?" Clara's smile was radiant. "That's a yes." They completed the drive into town with clasped hands, and when Jonas helped Clara down at the boarding house, he held on a moment longer than necessary. "Tomorrow?" he asked. "Christmas Eve dinner at the ranch? I know it's fast, but Ellie would love to have you, and I—" He stopped, fumbling for words. "I'd like you to be there." Clara's eyes softened. "I'd be honored. What time should I arrive?" 3 o'clock? Gives you time to settle in after whatever preparations you need to do." 3 o'clock? Clara confirmed. Then, with a glance around to ensure they weren't being observed too closely, she rose on her toes and pressed a quick kiss to his cheek. "Thank you, Jonas. For today. For all of it." She disappeared into the boarding house before Jonas could respond, leaving him standing beside the wagon with a hand pressed to his cheek and a heart that felt like it might burst. Ellie was waiting at the Hendersons, practically vibrating with anxiety, until Jonas walked through the door. She threw herself at him, with enough force to nearly knock him over. Papa, Mrs. Henderson said there was a fire and you went inside and I'm fine, sweetheart. Jonas held her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, letting her solid presence ground him. Everything's fine. Is Miss Wynne okay? Did she go with you? Mrs. Henderson said she saw Miss Wynne in the wagon. Miss Wynne is fine too. Jonas pulled back to look at his daughter's worried face. More than fine. She was very brave today. She helped save the horses? She did. Ellie's face transformed from worry to wonder. She's amazing, isn't she, Papa? Jonas thought about Clara moving through fire and smoke with steady determination, about her calming, terrified horses with nothing but her voice, about the way she'd kissed him in the snow like she'd been waiting her whole life to do it. Yeah, Ellie girl, he said softly. She really is. Later that evening, after Ellie was asleep and Jonas sat alone by the fire, he finally allowed himself to fully process what had happened. Not just the fire, though that had been terrifying enough, but the shift that had occurred in his own heart. For 3 years, he'd been frozen, locked in a winter of his own making. He'd convinced himself it was for Ellie's sake, to protect her from more loss. But sitting there in the firelight, Jonas could finally admit the truth. He'd been protecting himself, keeping everyone at arm's length so he'd never have to risk his heart again. And then Clara Wynne had arrived on a stage from Boston, all sharp intelligence and hidden vulnerability, and she'd melted something Jonas thought was frozen solid. She'd shown him that courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was acting despite the fear. Walking into burning barns, opening closed hearts, taking chances on new beginnings. Jonas stood and moved to the window, looking out over the snow-covered valley. Somewhere in town, Clara was probably doing the same thing, processing her own fears and possibilities. Tomorrow was Christmas Eve. Tomorrow Clara would come to the ranch, would share a meal with him and Ellie, would become part of their small family circle in a way that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Jonas pressed his hand against the cold glass, watching his breath fog the window. I'm going to try, Sarah, he whispered to the night, to the memory of his first wife, to the ghost of his former life. I'm going to try to move forward. I hope that's okay. The only answer was the wind sighing through the pines and the crackle of the fire behind him. But somehow, Jonas felt a sense of peace settle over him, as if Sarah herself was giving him permission to live again, to love again, to stop being afraid. He went to bed that night with smoke still clinging to his clothes and Clara's kiss still burning on his lips. And for the first time in 3 years, Jonas Merrick fell asleep with something that felt remarkably like hope warming his chest. The next morning dawned clear and cold, Christmas Eve, with all its promise and possibility. Jonas was up early, nervous energy driving him through the chores faster than usual. He wanted everything perfect for Clara's visit, wanted the house warm and welcoming, wanted Ellie on her best behavior, wanted... He stopped himself, recognizing the spiraling anxiety for what it was. Fear dressed up as preparation. He'd invited Clara for dinner, not asked her to marry him. There was no need to panic, except that somewhere deep inside, Jonas suspected this dinner was the beginning of something that would lead exactly there, to marriage, to family, to all the things he'd thought he'd lost forever. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, it filled him with a cautious, fragile joy. Ellie was beside herself with excitement, changing her dress 3 times before Jonas finally put his foot down. She insisted on baking cookies, a recipe Sarah had taught her years ago that somehow the child remembered, and the house filled with the scent of cinnamon and sugar. At precisely 3 o'clock, Jonas heard the sound of a wagon approaching. He looked out to see Clara driving herself in a small buggy borrowed from the boarding house, managing the horse with competent ease. She wore a deep blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, and her hair was pinned up in an intricate style that must have taken significant effort. Jonas met her at the door, helping her down from the buggy, acutely aware of Ellie watching from the window with barely contained glee. "You look beautiful," he said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Clara blushed, pleasure brightening her face. "Thank you. You look quite handsome yourself." They stood there for a moment, suddenly awkward after yesterday's intensity, before Ellie burst through the door and wrapped herself around Clara's waist. "Miss Wynne, you came. I made cookies and Papa made roast chicken and we have everything ready. Clara laughed, returning the embrace. I wouldn't have missed it for anything, Ellie. The afternoon unfolded with an ease that surprised Jonas. Clara fit into their home as if she'd always been there, admiring Ellie's carefully set table, complimenting the decorations they'd hung, making conversation that flowed naturally between serious and light. She asked questions about the ranch, about their routines, about Ellie's interests, and she listened to the answers with genuine attention. Over dinner, they talked about everything and nothing. Clara's first impressions of Montana, Jonas's plans for expanding the herd next year, Ellie's hopes for the new school term. The conversation was punctuated by laughter and comfortable silences, the kind that only happened when people were genuinely at ease with each other. After the meal, Ellie convinced Clara to play a game by the fire while Jonas cleaned up. He could hear them through the open doorway, Ellie's bright chatter and Clara's patient responses, and something in his chest expanded until it almost hurt. This, he thought, this is what I've been missing. This is what Ellie needs, what we both need. When Ellie finally succumbed to exhaustion and Jonas carried her up to bed, she wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, Papa, I really, really like Miss Wynne. Can she stay? She has to go back to the boarding house tonight, sweetheart. That's not what I mean. Ellie's eyes were serious, far too knowing for 6 years old. I mean, can she stay with us forever? Jonas's heart stuttered. Ellie, I asked Santa for a mother for Christmas, Ellie said, the words tumbling out in a rush. I know Mama's gone and she's not coming back, but Papa, you're so lonely and I want you to be happy again. And Miss Wynne makes you smile and she's so nice. And slow down, Jonas said gently, sitting on the edge of her bed. What exactly did you tell Santa? I told him I wanted a mother for Christmas, a real one who would stay with us and love us and make our family whole again. Ellie's eyes filled with tears. Is that bad? Is it bad that I want that when Mama's gone? Jonas pulled his daughter close, his own eyes burning. No, sweetheart, that's not bad at all. It's natural and normal and exactly what you should want. But can she stay? Can Miss Wynne be our new mama? Jonas struggled for words. That's complicated, Ellie. Miss Wynne and I, we're just getting to know each other. These things take time. But you like her, don't you? I saw you kiss her yesterday. Mrs. Henderson told me all about it. Of course she had. Jonas made a mental note to have words with Martha Henderson about discretion. I do like her, Jonas admitted, very much. But that doesn't mean... Ellie, I can't make you any promises right now, except that I'll try. I'll try to be open to possibilities, to not let fear rule me. Can that be enough? Ellie considered this seriously, then nodded. That's enough. For now. She settled into sleep with the easy adaptability of children, leaving Jonas to return downstairs where Clara waited by the fire. She'd been looking at the photographs on the mantel, Jonas and Sarah on their wedding day, a family portrait taken just months before Sarah's death. She was beautiful, Clara said softly as Jonas approached. Ellie looks just like her. She does. Jonas stood beside Clara, looking at his late wife's face. Sometimes it hurts to see it. Other times, it's a comfort. Clara was quiet for a moment, then asked, Do you still love her? The question could have been accusatory, jealous, but Clara's tone held only genuine curiosity. Jonas considered his answer carefully. Part of me always will, he said honestly. She was my first love, the mother of my child, but the sharp pain of losing her, that's faded. What's left is gratitude, I suppose. For the years we had, the life we built, the daughter she gave me. That's beautiful, Clara said. And healthy. I'd worry if you felt nothing at all. Jonas turned to face her fully. And you? The man in Boston. Do you still carry feelings for him? Anger, mostly, Clara admitted with a rueful smile. An embarrassment that I didn't see as deception sooner. But love? No. I'm not sure I ever truly loved him. I loved the idea of him, the life he represented. But the actual man? She shook her head. No. Jonas reached for her hand, threading their fingers together. Clara, there's something I need to tell you, something Ellie just revealed. He explained about Ellie's wish to Santa. Watching Clara's expression shift from surprise to understanding, to something that looked almost like longing. "Oh, that sweet child," Clara whispered, "and what a burden to place on herself, thinking she's responsible for your happiness." "She's not wrong, though," Jonas said. "I have been lonely, and you do make me smile. And the idea of you becoming part of our family." He stopped, suddenly vulnerable in a way that made his chest tight. "It doesn't scare me as much as it should." Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Jonas, we've known each other less than 2 weeks." "I know. This is impossibly fast." "I know that too. And yet," Clara said softly, stepping closer, "I can't seem to find it in myself to be sensible about this. Every reasonable bone in my body is screaming that we should slow down, be cautious. But my heart, what does your heart say?" Clara's free hand came up to rest against his chest, right over where his own heart was pounding. "My heart says you're worth the risk, that Ellie is worth the risk, that maybe, just maybe, we're all exactly what each other needs." Jonas covered her hand with his own, holding it against his heartbeat. "I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to know you can say no, that there's no pressure, no expectations. Ask." "Stay for Christmas," Jonas said. "Not just for dinner tomorrow, but the whole day. Let Ellie wake up Christmas morning with you here. Let us start building this, whatever this is, without quite so much fear between us." Clara searched his face, and Jonas could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Caution versus courage. Safety versus possibility. "I'll stay," she said finally, and Jonas felt something in his chest crack wide open, flooding with warmth and light and terrifying hope. "But Jonas, we need to be honest with Ellie. No false promises. No guarantees we can't keep." "Agreed." They stood there by the fire, hands clasped, the future stretching out before them full of both promise and uncertainty. Outside, the first snowflakes of Christmas Eve began to fall, blanketing the valley in fresh white. Inside, 2 wounded hearts tentatively reached toward each other, daring to hope that second chances were real. "Tell me something," Clara said after a long moment. "Something true. Something you're afraid to say." Jonas took a breath, then let the truth tumble out. "I'm afraid I'm not enough, that I can't give you the life you deserve, that my grief has damaged me too much, that I'll disappoint you somehow, and you'll leave, and Ellie will be devastated, and I won't survive losing someone else. He stopped, the words catching. "Someone you what?" Clara prompted gently. "Someone I'm falling in love with," Jonas finished quietly. "Even though it's too soon and too fast, and probably completely insane." Clara's breath caught. "Jonas!" "Your turn," he interrupted. "Tell me something true." Clara's smile was tremulous, her eyes bright. "I'm falling in love with you too, and it terrifies me because I came here to avoid exactly this, to avoid putting my heart in someone else's hands. But with you, with Ellie, it feels different. It feels like coming home." They came together in a kiss that was different from the one in the snow, slower, deeper, full of promise rather than desperation. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Jonas rested his forehead against Clara's. "Merry Christmas, Clara Wynne." "Merry Christmas, Jonas Merrick." They settled onto the sofa, Clara tucked against Jonas's side, watching the fire burn low while snow continued to fall outside. Neither spoke, both simply existing in the moment, in the miraculous possibility of new beginnings. And upstairs, tucked safe in her bed, Ellie Merrick slept with a smile on her face, her Christmas wish already halfway to coming true. Jonas woke on Christmas morning to find weak winter sunlight streaming through his bedroom window and the sound of excited whispers drifting up from downstairs. For a moment, he simply lay there, disoriented by the unfamiliar lightness in his chest, before memory came flooding back. Clara had stayed. Clara was downstairs with Ellie right now, probably being subjected to an enthusiastic tour of Christmas stockings and the modest gifts Jonas had managed to gather. He dressed quickly, running a hand through his hair and telling himself the flutter of nerves in his stomach was ridiculous. This was just Christmas morning, just breakfast with his daughter, and a woman he'd known for barely 2 weeks. A woman he'd admitted to falling in love with just hours ago. The flutter intensified. When Jonas reached the bottom of the stairs, he stopped, arrested by the scene before him. Clara sat cross-legged on the floor in front of the fireplace, still wearing the dress from yesterday. Slightly rumpled now, but somehow making her look more real, more accessible. Ellie was nestled against her side, and they were examining the contents of Ellie's stocking with serious concentration. "And this is a hair ribbon," Ellie was explaining. "Papa always gets me one for Christmas because he says Mama loved pretty ribbons." "It's beautiful," Clara replied, running the red silk through her fingers. "And very practical, too. Would you like me to show you a new way to tie it?" "Yes, please." Jonas cleared his throat, and both heads turned toward him. Ellie's face lit up like a candle. "Papa, Merry Christmas. Look, Miss Wynne stayed. She's still here." "I see that." Jonas moved into the room, his eyes meeting Clara's over his daughter's head. "Merry Christmas, Ellie girl. Merry Christmas, Clara." "Merry Christmas," Clara replied, and something in her smile made Jonas's heart do that ridiculous flutter again. They spent the morning in a haze of simple joy. Jonas made his traditional Christmas breakfast, flapjacks with butter and molasses, while Clara and Ellie set the table with exaggerated care. They exchanged modest gifts, and Jonas watched with quiet pleasure as Clara unwrapped the warm wool scarf he'd commissioned from Mrs. Henderson, her eyes going soft when she realized he'd remembered her mentioning the cold. Clara's gift to Ellie was a beautiful leather-bound journal with blank pages. "For writing your own stories," Clara explained, "or drawing pictures or keeping track of your thoughts, whatever you like." Ellie clutched it to her chest like treasure, and Jonas saw his daughter's eyes fill with the kind of wonder that made his throat tight. Clara's gift to Jonas was more practical, a new pair of work gloves, clearly expensive, probably bought with money she couldn't really spare. But it was the note tucked inside that made Jonas's breath catch. "For building new things. With hope for the future, see." After breakfast, they bundled up and ventured outside to build a snowman in the yard. Ellie insisted it needed a family: a papa snowman, a mama snowman, and a little girl snowman. Jonas and Clara exchanged a look over Ellie's head that was equal parts amused and terrified, but they built what she requested, watching as Ellie carefully arranged stick arms so the snow parents appeared to be holding hands. "She's not subtle, is she?" Clara murmured as Ellie ran off to find the perfect stones for eyes. "Never has been," Jonas replied. He hesitated, then added, "Does it bother you? The expectation she's already building?" Clara was quiet for a moment, her breath misting in the cold air. "It should, probably. It's too much pressure too soon. But Jonas, when I look at her, when I look at both of you, all I feel is this overwhelming sense of rightness. Like I've been traveling my whole life and finally arrived where I was supposed to be all along." Jonas reached for her hand, squeezing gently. "I feel it too, and it scares the hell out of me." "Good," Clara said, surprising him. "If we weren't scared, we wouldn't be taking this seriously enough. Fear means we understand what's at stake." They were interrupted by Ellie's return, triumphantly bearing perfect pebbles for the snowman family's eyes. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of play and laughter, and Jonas couldn't remember the last time his face had hurt from smiling so much. By early afternoon, the temperature had dropped enough that they retreated indoors. Ellie immediately claimed Clara for a tea party with her dolls, leaving Jonas to prepare a simple supper. He worked in the kitchen, listening to the sound of Ellie's bright chatter and Clara's patient responses, and felt something settle in his chest that he hadn't even realized was unsettled. This could be his life. This warmth, this completeness, this sense of family that had been missing for so long. All he had to do was be brave enough to reach for it. As evening approached and the sky began to darken, Ellie's energy finally flagged. She curled up on the sofa between Jonas and Clara, fighting sleep with the stubbornness of a child who didn't want Christmas to end. "Tell me a story," she mumbled, her head resting against Clara's shoulder. "What kind of story?" Clara asked, stroking Ellie's hair with gentle fingers. "A princess story, but not a regular one. One where the princess is brave and saves people." Clara glanced at Jonas, a question in her eyes. He nodded encouragement, curious to hear what she'd create. "Once upon a time," Clara began, her voice taking on the cadence of a practiced storyteller, "there was a princess who lived in a tall tower in a faraway kingdom. But this princess wasn't waiting to be rescued. She was learning everything she could about the world, reading books, studying stars, practicing sword fighting when no one was watching." Ellie's eyes, which had been drooping, opened wider. "She knew how to fight?" She did, because this princess understood that sometimes you have to save yourself before anyone else can help you. One day, a great dragon came to the kingdom, breathing fire and frightening all the people. The king sent his bravest knights to fight it, but they all came back defeated. What did the princess do? Ellie was fully awake now, leaning forward. She put on armor, took up a sword, and rode out to face the dragon herself. But when she got there, she discovered something interesting. The dragon wasn't trying to hurt anyone. It was just scared and lonely, far from its home, breathing fire because it didn't know how else to protect itself. Jonas found himself as captivated as Ellie, watching Clara's face as she wove the tale. So instead of fighting, Clara continued, the princess talked to the dragon. She listened to its story, and together they figured out a way for the dragon to return home safely and for the kingdom to understand that sometimes the things we fear aren't really dangerous. They're just different and scared and in need of understanding. That's a good story, Ellie said sleepily. The princess was smart. She was, Clara agreed, and brave, not because she wasn't afraid, but because she acted despite her fear. Ellie was asleep within minutes, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of childhood slumber. Jonas carefully lifted her and carried her upstairs, tucking her into bed and pressing a kiss to her forehead. When he returned to the living room, he found Clara standing by the window, looking out at the snow-covered valley bathed in moonlight. That was some story, Jonas said, moving to stand beside her. I thought you might appreciate a princess who didn't need rescuing. Clara glanced at him. Though I suppose there's nothing wrong with accepting help when it's offered either. Is that what we're doing? Helping each other? I think so. Clara turned to face him fully. Jonas, we need to talk about what happens next. Christmas is over. Tomorrow I need to return to the boarding house, start preparing for the school term. Real life resumes. Jonas felt his stomach clench. Are you saying, I'm saying we need a plan, Clara interrupted gently. We can't exist in this bubble forever. People are already talking. We need to decide how we want to move forward, what we want this to be. Jonas took a breath, gathering his courage. What I want is to court you properly, officially, with everyone in town knowing my intentions are honorable and serious. And what are your intentions? To see if what we're feeling now can survive real life. Daily routines, hard work, the challenges that come with blending lives together. Jonas reached for her hands. And if it can, when it can, to ask you to marry me, to become part of this family, to help me raise Ellie and build a life that has room for all of us. Clara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. That's quite an intention. Too much? No. Clara squeezed his hands. Not too much. Terrifying, but not too much. Jonas, I need you to understand something. I'm not Sarah. I'll never be Sarah. I can't replace her, and I won't try. I'm not asking you to, Jonas said firmly. Sarah was my past. You're my future. They're not the same thing, and they don't need to be. And Ellie? She's already building expectations. What if we try this and it doesn't work? What if I'm not what she needs, or what you need, or... Jonas silenced her with a kiss, gentle and reassuring. When he pulled back, he kept his forehead resting against hers. What if it does work? He countered. What if you're exactly what we need, and we're exactly what you need? What if we stop being so afraid of failure that we don't even try? Clara let out a shaky laugh. When did you become the brave one? About the time I watched you walk into a burning barn without hesitation. Jonas pulled back enough to meet her eyes. You taught me something, Clara. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it. So I'm choosing to act. I'm choosing to court you, to pursue this relationship, to see where it leads. The question is, are you willing to choose the same thing? For a long moment, Claire just looked at him, her sharp eyes searching his face for something Jonas hoped she'd find. Then, slowly, her expression softened into something that looked remarkably like joy. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'm willing to choose this. To choose you. To choose the possibility of us. They sealed the decision with another kiss, this one deeper, full of promise and commitment. When they finally separated, both slightly breathless, Jonas felt lighter than he had in years. So Clara said, a hint of laughter in her voice. How exactly does one court properly in Montana territory? I'm afraid my Boston etiquette might not translate. Jonas grinned. Well, first I take you to church on Sunday with Ellie. Let the whole town see us sitting together. Then maybe Sunday supper with your landlady present as chaperone. Afternoon drives when the weather permits. Evening visits with Ellie as permanent chaperone. Very proper, very respectable. Sounds dreadfully boring, Clara teased. Oh, I don't know, Jonas replied, pulling her closer. I suspect you could make even propriety interesting. They talked long into the night, making plans and sharing dreams. Clara spoke of the school she wanted to build, not just a place for learning letters and numbers, but a community center where ideas could flourish. Jonas talked about expanding the ranch again, maybe hiring help come spring so he'd have more time for other pursuits. They discussed Ellie's education, the repairs still needed on the schoolhouse, the rhythms of ranch life that Clara would need to understand. It was practical and romantic all at once, grounding their feelings in the reality of daily life while still leaving room for the magic of new love. As midnight approached, Jonas finally, reluctantly, suggested that Clara should get some rest. They'd need to make the drive back to town early tomorrow, and propriety demanded she not spend another night under his roof unchaperoned, Christmas miracle or not. Will you regret this? Clara asked as she gathered her things. In the morning, when you've had time to think clearly, will you wish you'd been more cautious? Jonas took her face in his hands, making sure she could see the certainty in his eyes. The only thing I'll regret is wasting 3 years being afraid. I'm done with that, Clara. I'm done letting fear make my decisions. Clara smiled, rising on her toes to kiss him softly. Then I'll see you tomorrow, and every day after that, you'll have me. Jonas walked her to the guest room where she'd slept the night before, propriety satisfied, if barely. At the door, he caught her hand one more time. Clara, thank you for staying, for taking a chance on us, for being exactly who you are. Thank you for letting me in, Clara replied, for trusting me with your heart and with Ellie's. I won't take that trust lightly. Jonas returned to his own room but found sleep elusive. His mind spun with everything that had happened, everything that might happen. Just 2 weeks ago, he'd been a man frozen in grief, going through the motions of life without really living. Now he was planning a future, making room in his heart for new love, daring to hope for happiness. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. The next morning dawned cold and bright. Jonas made breakfast while Clara helped Ellie dress, and the three of them shared one last meal before the demands of real life intruded. Ellie chattered about all her Christmas gifts, about the Snow family in the yard, about how she couldn't wait for school to start so she could learn more stories like the one Miss Wynne had told. The drive into town was quiet, Ellie dozing between them, worn out from 2 days of excitement. Jonas kept stealing glances at Clara, memorizing the way morning light caught in her auburn hair, the peaceful expression on her face, the way she absently stroked Ellie's hair as the child slept. This is real, he kept thinking. This is actually happening. I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm living. When they reached the boarding house, Mrs. Henderson was waiting on the porch with a knowing smile that made Jonas's ears burn. Merry Christmas, Mr. Merrick, she called out cheerfully. I trust Miss Wynne had a pleasant holiday? Very pleasant, thank you, Clara replied with admirable composure, though Jonas noticed the faint blush on her cheeks. The Merricks were most hospitable. I'm sure they were. Mrs. Henderson's eyes twinkled with barely suppressed amusement. Well, come inside, dear. I've kept your breakfast warm. Before Clara could step away, Jonas caught her hand. Tomorrow? I'll come by after church? Tomorrow, Clara confirmed, squeezing his fingers. Then with a glance at Mrs. Henderson and a decision that made Jonas's heart swell, she leaned up and kissed his cheek in full view of her landlady and anyone else who might be watching. Thank you for everything, Jonas. I'll see you soon. She disappeared into the boarding house, leaving Jonas standing by the wagon with a sleeping Ellie and a heart so full he thought it might overflow. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm that Jonas had never imagined could be his. Every day he'd complete the ranch work, then drive into town to continue repairs on the schoolhouse. Clara would be there waiting, and they'd work side by side while Ellie explored or practiced her letters in the journal Clara had given her. On Sundays, they attended church together. Jonas, Ellie, and Clara sitting in the Merrick family pew while the town watched with barely concealed interest. Afterwards, they'd have dinner at the boarding house with Mrs. Henderson playing chaperone, though the older woman had a convenient tendency to disappear when she deemed privacy appropriate. Jonas took Clara on afternoon drives when weather permitted, showing her the valley he'd lived in all his life, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories. Clara shared her own stories in return, about Boston, about her family, about the dreams she'd set aside when she'd tried to fit herself into someone else's expectations. "I always wanted to teach," she confessed one afternoon, as they sat overlooking the valley from a high ridge, "but my mother thought it was beneath me. She wanted me to marry well, to run a household, to be an ornament to some successful man's life. Teaching was supposed to be a hobby at best, not a vocation." "And the man you were engaged to?" Jonas asked. "Did he support your teaching?" Clara laughed bitterly. "He thought it was charming, like a child playing at being grown up. He fully expected me to give it up once we married." "Then he was a fool." Jonas took her hand, threading their fingers together. "Your teaching isn't a hobby or a game. It's who you are. Anyone who can't see that doesn't deserve you." Clara turned to look at him, her eyes soft. "You see me clearly, don't you? Not what you want me to be, but who I actually am." "I try," Jonas replied. "Same as you see me. Not the grieving widower everyone expects me to stay, but the man I'm becoming, the man I want to be." These conversations became the foundation of their courtship, honest, sometimes uncomfortable, always authentic. They talked about their fears and hopes, about their pasts and potential futures. They discussed how to blend their lives, how to navigate the challenges that would inevitably come. And through it all, their love deepened from that first spark of attraction into something solid and real and lasting. The schoolhouse repairs progressed steadily. By mid-January, the roof was completely rebuilt, all the windows replaced, and the interior scrubbed and painted. Other men from town had joined the effort. Dave Peterson, still grateful for the rescue of his horses, contributed lumber and labor. The Henderson boys helped with the heavy lifting. Even old Dutch Schmidt came by to repair the desks with the skill of a craftsman. Clara watched it all with barely concealed emotion, and Jonas understood why. The town wasn't just building her a schoolhouse. They were welcoming her, accepting her as one of their own, showing her that she'd found a place where she belonged. One evening in late January, as they stood in the completed schoolhouse admiring the work, Clara turned to Jonas with tears streaming down her face. "It's perfect," she whispered. "It's everything I dreamed of and more." Jonas pulled her close, holding her while she cried happy tears against his shoulder. "You did this," he said. "You inspired people to care again, to invest in something bigger than themselves. This isn't just a building, Clara. It's a future. For Ellie and all the other children who will learn here. That's your gift to this town." "Our gift," Clara corrected, pulling back to look at him. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, without all of you." The school term began the first week of February, and Jonas had never seen Clara more animated. She threw herself into teaching with a passion that was beautiful to witness, and Ellie bloomed under her instruction. The other children adored her too. Clara had a gift for making learning feel like adventure rather than obligation. Jonas would pick Ellie up from school each afternoon, and he'd watch Clara with her students, seeing yet another facet of this remarkable woman he'd fallen in love with. She was patient but firm, creative but structured, encouraging but honest. She saw each child as an individual and adapted her teaching to meet them where they were. "She's really something, isn't she?" Dave Peterson commented one afternoon as they both waited for their children. "You're Clara." Jonas felt warmth bloom in his chest at the possessive. "She really is." "So when are you going to make it official?" Dave asked bluntly. "The whole town's waiting for you to ask her proper. You've been courting near on 2 months now. That's plenty long enough to know your own mind." Jonas knew Dave was right. He'd known for weeks that he wanted to marry Clara, wanted to build a life with her, wanted to wake up every morning with her beside him. The question wasn't whether to ask, but when and how. He wanted it to be special, meaningful, something Clara would remember for the rest of her life, and he had an idea of exactly how to do it. The next Sunday after church, Jonas approached Clara with studied casualness. "Would you like to go for a ride this afternoon? There's a place I want to show you." Clara smiled, that warm expression that still made his heart skip. "I'd love to. Should I bring Ellie?" "If you don't mind, Mrs. Henderson offered to keep her for the afternoon. Seems she's teaching Ellie to knit." Something flickered in Clara's eyes. Awareness, perhaps, that this invitation was different somehow. "All right then. Just the two of us." Jonas picked her up at 2 o'clock, and they drove out of town toward the high ridge that overlooked the valley. It was the same place he'd brought her weeks ago, but today felt different. The late winter sun was warm despite the cold air, and the valley spread below them like a patchwork quilt of white and brown. Jonas helped Clara down from the wagon, then led her to the edge of the ridge where the view was most spectacular. "This is my favorite place in the world," he said quietly. "My father brought me here when I was a boy and told me that someday all of this would be mine to protect and preserve. When I married Sarah, I brought her here and made the same promise, that I'd build a life worth living in this valley, a legacy worth passing to our children." Clara listened silently, her hand in his, waiting. "After Sarah died, I didn't come here for 3 years," Jonas continued. "Couldn't bear it. This place represented the future, and I'd convinced myself I didn't have one anymore. Just an endless present to endure." "But you came back," Clara said softly. "I did, with you. And for the first time since losing Sarah, I could see a future again. Not the one I'd planned with her, but a different one. Just as real, just as valuable." Jonas turned to face Clara fully, taking both her hands in his. "Clara, you've given me back my life. You've shown me how to be brave again, how to hope again. You've helped me see that having loved and lost doesn't mean I can't love again." Clara's eyes were bright with tears. "Jonas, let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know it's only been 2 months. I know by Boston standards that's impossibly fast. But out here, we live by different rules. We trust our hearts because life's too short and too hard not to. And my heart is telling me with absolute certainty that you're meant to be part of this family, that you're meant to be here, in this valley, building a future with me and Ellie." He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Clara's breath caught as he opened it to reveal a simple gold band set with a single sapphire. "It was my grandmother's," Jonas said. "The only piece of jewelry from the old country that survived the journey west. My father gave it to my mother, and she gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for someone special, someone worthy of the Merrick name and all it represents." "Jonas," Clara whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks now. "Are you—" "Clara Wynne," Jonas said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Will you marry me? Will you become my wife, Ellie's mother, a partner in building this ranch and this life? Will you take a chance on a Montana cowboy who's done being afraid of the future?" For a moment, Clara just stared at him, tears streaming freely, her expression a mix of joy and disbelief and something that looked like awe. Then she laughed through her tears, a sound of pure happiness. "Yes," she said, the word coming out choked with emotion. "Yes, Jonas Merrick, I'll marry you. I'll be your wife and Ellie's mother and your partner in everything. I'll take that chance, and I'll never regret it." Jonas slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and then they were in each other's arms, kissing with a passion tempered by tenderness, sealing a promise that would bind their lives together. When they finally pulled apart, both laughing and crying at once, Clara held up her hand to watch the sapphire catch the sunlight. "It's beautiful," she said, "and it fits perfectly." "Like you," Jonas replied. "You fit perfectly into our lives, into my heart." They stood on that ridge for a long time, holding each other, looking out over the valley that would be their home, talking about wedding dates and future plans and all the dreams they'd build together. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Jonas felt a peace settle over him so complete it was almost physical. This was right. This was meant to be. Clara was his second chance, his new beginning, proof that love could bloom even in the hardest winters. As they drove back to town in the fading light, Clara leaned against his shoulder, the ring gleaming on her finger. "We should tell Ellie first," she said, "before anyone else. She deserves to know her Christmas wish came true." Jonas pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "She's going to be over the moon." "I hope so." Clara's voice held a hint of nervousness. Jonas, I want to be clear about something. I'm not trying to replace her mother. I could never do that. But I want to love her as my own, if she'll let me. Is that all right? It's more than all right, Jonas assured her. It's exactly what both of us need. Sarah will always be Ellie's mother, the woman who gave her life. But you'll be her mother too, in a different way. The woman who helps her grow up, who guides her, who's there for all the moments Sarah can't be. There's room in a child's heart for both. Trust me. When they collected Ellie from Mrs. Henderson's, Jonas caught his daughter's eye and nodded slightly. Ellie's eyes went wide, darting between her father's face and the ring on Clara's finger. Papa? Her voice was small, hopeful, barely daring to believe. We have something to tell you, sweetheart, Jonas said, kneeling so he was at her eye level. Clara knelt beside him, taking Ellie's small hands in hers. Ellie, Clara said gently, your papa has asked me to marry him, to become part of your family, and I said yes, but before we make any final plans, we wanted to make sure that's all right with you. This is your family too, and your feelings matter very much to both of us. Ellie looked between them, her expression serious in that way she had when processing important information. Then, slowly, a smile began to spread across her face, growing wider and brighter until it seemed to illuminate the entire room. My wish came true, she whispered. Santa really did bring me a mother for Christmas. She launched herself at both of them with enough force to nearly knock them over, wrapping her arms around their necks and squeezing tight. Jonas felt Clara's shoulders shaking and realized she was crying again, happy tears soaking into Ellie's hair. Is that a yes, then? Jonas asked, his own voice rough with emotion. That's the biggest yes ever, Ellie said, pulling back to look at Clara with shining eyes. Can I call you Mama, or would you rather I call you Miss Wynne? Clara's face crumpled, and she pulled Ellie close again. You can call me whatever feels right to you, sweetheart. If Mama feels right, then that's what I'll be. And if not, that's all right too. We'll figure it out together. I think Mama Clara, Ellie decided. So I remember both my mamas, the one in heaven and the one right here. Jonas had to turn away for a moment, overcome by the simple wisdom of his 6-year-old daughter and the impossibility of this moment he'd never dared to dream. When he turned back, Clara was watching him with eyes that held understanding and love and gratitude. They'd done it. They'd pushed past fear and grief and caution to reach for something better. They'd chosen courage over safety, hope over despair, love over loneliness. And somehow, impossibly, it had all worked out. The news spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire, and the town's reaction was overwhelmingly positive. Mrs. Henderson immediately began planning an engagement party. Martha Peterson started organizing a quilting circle to make wedding gifts. The men at the general store clapped Jonas on the back and offered congratulations with genuine warmth. There were a few raised eyebrows about the speed of the courtship, but mostly people seemed pleased that Jonas had found happiness again and that Ellie would have a mother. Clara was already beloved as a teacher, already seen as part of the community. This just made it official. They set the wedding date for the first Sunday in April, giving them time to prepare but not so long that the waiting would become unbearable. Clara would finish out the school term, then they'd marry in a simple ceremony at the church with the whole town invited. In the weeks that followed, Jonas felt like he was living in a dream. He and Clara planned their future with careful attention to practical details, where she'd sleep until the wedding, how to combine their possessions, what changes might be needed to make the ranch house truly theirs rather than just his. They talked about expanding the herd, about Clara continuing to teach, about giving Ellie siblings if they were blessed with more children. Everything was falling into place with a rightness that still sometimes took Jonas's breath away. The frozen cowboy who'd existed for 3 years was gone, replaced by a man who smiled easily, who looked forward to each new day, who'd learned that second chances were real if you were brave enough to reach for them. And through it all, Ellie bloomed. She had her Mama Clara now, and a future full of possibilities stretched before her. Her Christmas wish had come true in the best possible way, bringing joy not just to herself, but to everyone she loved. Winter began its slow retreat from Montana territory, and with it came the promise of spring. New beginnings, fresh starts, and a future brighter than anything Jonas Merrick had dared to imagine on that snowy Christmas night when a little girl whispered a wish and a brave woman walked into his life. The weeks between the engagement and the wedding passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jonas found himself caught between wanting time to slow down so he could savor every moment of this journey and wanting to race forward to the day when Clara would finally, legally, permanently be his wife. March arrived with the first whispers of spring, patches of bare ground appearing where snow had melted, the sound of water running in the creeks, birds returning from their southern migrations. The ranch began to wake up from its winter sleep, and Jonas threw himself into the work with renewed energy. He was building more than just a ranch now. He was building a home, a future, a legacy for the family he was creating. Clara continued teaching through the weeks, but she spent every weekend at the ranch, learning the rhythms of ranch life and helping Jonas plan the expansion he'd put off for so long. They walked the property together, discussing where to add new pastures, where to build the larger barn Jonas had been dreaming of, where to plant the vegetable garden Clara insisted would save them money and provide fresh food. "You're nesting," Martha Henderson teased one Sunday after church, watching Clara describe her garden plans with animated gestures. "It's sweet to see." Clara blushed but didn't deny it. "I've spent my whole life in cities and towns. The idea of growing our own food, of being self-sufficient, it's exciting, different from anything I've known." "It's also hard work," Martha warned, though her tone was kind. "Ranch life isn't easy, especially for someone who didn't grow up with it." "I know," Clara replied, her voice steady. "But I'm not afraid of hard work, and I'd rather build something meaningful with Jonas than have an easy life without him." Martha's expression softened. "He's lucky to have you. You're good for him, Clara. You've brought him back to life." But despite the joy and anticipation, there were moments when doubt crept in. For both of them. Late one evening, 3 weeks before the wedding, Jonas found Clara standing alone in the schoolhouse after everyone else had left. She was staring at the empty desks with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Clara?" He approached carefully. "What's wrong?" She turned and he saw tears on her cheeks. "I'm scared," she admitted. "What if I'm not good enough? What if I can't adapt to ranch life? What if I fail Ellie, or fail you, or—" Jonas crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her while she trembled. "You're already good enough," he said firmly. "More than good enough. And you're not going to fail anyone. We're building this life together, Clara. That means we'll make mistakes together, learn together, grow together." "But what if—" "No more what ifs," Jonas interrupted gently. "We could what if ourselves into paralysis. What if the ranch fails? What if one of us gets sick? What if 100 different disasters strike? We can't live our lives preparing for every possible catastrophe. We just have to trust that we'll face whatever comes together." Clara pulled back to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "You're sure about this? About me? No doubts at all?" "I have doubts," Jonas admitted, surprising her. "I doubt whether I'll be a good enough husband, whether I can make you happy in this isolated place, whether I'm selfish for asking you to give up the wider world for life on a Montana ranch. But Clara, the one thing I don't doubt is that I love you, that you're meant to be here with us. That's the bedrock truth everything else is built on." Clara's arms came around his waist, holding tight. "I love you too, so much it terrifies me. I never thought I'd feel this way about anyone." They stood there in the empty schoolhouse, holding each other while the last light faded from the windows. It wasn't the first time they'd comforted each other through moments of doubt, and Jonas suspected it wouldn't be the last. But that was part of building a life together, being honest about fears while not letting those fears win. The following week brought a different kind of challenge. Jonas was in town picking up supplies when he overheard 2 women talking outside the general store. He wasn't intentionally eavesdropping, but their voices carried clearly. "I still say it's too fast," one woman, Mrs. Pritchard, the banker's wife, was saying. 2 months of courting and then straight to marriage? What's the rush?" "Maybe there is a rush, if you know what I mean," the other woman replied with a knowing tone. Jonas felt his jaw clench, anger rising hot and fast. He started to turn toward them, ready to defend Clara's honor, when a hand caught his arm. "Don't." Clara had appeared beside him, her face pale but composed. "It's not worth it. They're implying—" "I know what they're implying," Clara said quietly. "And it doesn't matter. We know the truth. The people who matter know the truth. Let them talk. But Jonas could see the hurt in her eyes, could see how the gossip wounded her despite her brave words. That night, after Ellie was asleep, he brought it up again. "I should have said something," he said, pacing the kitchen while Clara sat at the table. "I should have defended you." "And made it worse?" Clara shook her head. "Jonas, there will always be gossips, always people who judge without knowing the full story. We can't control what they say or think. We can only control how we respond. It's not fair to you." "Life rarely is," Clara replied with a sad smile. "But I didn't come to Montana expecting fair. I came looking for a fresh start, for a place where I could build something meaningful. And I found it. I found you. A few mean-spirited gossips aren't going to change that." Jonas knelt beside her chair, taking her hands. "You're stronger than I am." "I've had more practice ignoring gossip," Clara said. "After my broken engagement, half of Boston had opinions about my life. I learned that the only opinion that matters is my own, and the opinions of people I love and respect. Everyone else is just noise." Her strength humbled him, reminded him why he'd fallen in love with her in the first place. Clara wasn't fragile despite her refined exterior. She was steel wrapped in silk, capable of withstanding whatever storms came her way. The incident did have one positive outcome, however. The next Sunday at church, Reverend Matthews gave a sermon on judgment and compassion that was clearly directed at the town gossips. He spoke about how Jesus associated with sinners and outcasts, how he reserved his harshest words for those who judged others while ignoring their own faults. "Love is always worthy of celebration," the Reverend said, his eyes sweeping the congregation. "When two good people find each other and choose to build a life together, that's a blessing. The timeline doesn't matter. The appearances don't matter. What matters is the commitment, the integrity, the genuine care they show for each other and for the community they're part of." Jonas felt Clara's hand find his, squeezing gently. Several people in the congregation had the grace to look ashamed, including Mrs. Pritchard. After the service, a line of townsfolk approached them with apologies and well wishes. Mrs. Pritchard herself came forward, her face red with embarrassment. "I owe you both an apology," she said stiffly. "I spoke without thinking, repeated rumors without considering the harm they could cause. You're both good people, and I'm truly happy for you." Clara accepted the apology with grace, and Jonas marveled again at her capacity for forgiveness. She could have been cold, could have held the grudge. Instead, she chose kindness. As April approached, the final wedding preparations intensified. Clara spent her evenings after school sewing her wedding dress with help from Martha Henderson and several other women who'd decided to take the school teacher under their collective wing. Jonas worked on making the ranch house more suitable for a married couple, adding small touches he hoped would make Clara feel welcome: a bookshelf for the volumes she was bringing from Boston, new curtains in the bedroom, a writing desk by the window where she could work on lesson plans. Ellie was involved in everything, her excitement building to fever pitch. She'd been fitted for a new dress of her own, practiced walking down the aisle, holding imaginary flowers, and asked approximately 400 questions about what would happen after Mama Clara moved in permanently. "Will she sleep in your room, Papa?" Ellie asked one evening with the straightforward curiosity of childhood. "Yes," Jonas replied, feeling his ears burn. "That's what married people do. They share a room." "And then do you get a baby?" Jonas nearly choked on his coffee. That's not something we need to discuss right now, Ellie." "But Mrs. Henderson said that's how it works. First you get married, then you share a room, then God blesses you with babies." Ellie's expression was perfectly innocent. "I'd like a baby brother or sister. Do you think Mama Clara would like that too?" "I think," Jonas said carefully, "that's something Mama Clara and I will discuss privately. And if we're blessed with more children, you'll be the first to know. But right now, let's focus on the wedding, all right?" Ellie accepted this with the easy adaptability of children, moving on to her next question without missing a beat. But later, when Clara arrived for dinner, Jonas pulled her aside and mentioned the conversation. Clara laughed, though her cheeks were pink. "Children don't have the same sense of propriety we do. But, Jonas, we should probably discuss it. Do you want more children? I know Ellie is getting older and starting over with a baby." "I'd love more children," Jonas interrupted, "if we're blessed with them. But Clara, I want you to know whether we have a dozen more children or just Ellie, it doesn't matter to me. I'm not marrying you to replace Sarah or to give Ellie siblings. I'm marrying you because I love you. Everything else is just a bonus. Clara's eyes went soft. I'd like children too. I always imagined having a family. But you're right. Whether that happens or not, we'll be a family regardless. The three of us. The night before the wedding, Jonas couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning with 1,000 thoughts. Tomorrow, Clara would become his wife. Tomorrow, their lives would officially merge. Tomorrow, everything would change. Again. He found himself talking to Sarah in his head, something he hadn't done in months. I hope you're okay with this, he whispered into the darkness. I hope you understand that loving Clara doesn't mean I've forgotten you. You'll always be Ellie's mother, always be the woman who taught me what love was. But Clara, she's teaching me that love can happen twice, that hearts can heal and expand to hold new people without diminishing what came before. No answer came, but Jonas felt a peace settle over him. Sarah would have wanted him to be happy, would have wanted Ellie to have a mother. He knew that with absolute certainty. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with that particular quality of light that only Montana spring could provide. Jonas was up before sunrise, too nervous and excited to sleep. He dressed with unusual care in his Sunday best, a black suit he'd worn to his wedding with Sarah, but which he'd had altered and updated for this new beginning. Ellie appeared in his doorway, already dressed in her new pink dress, her hair in careful braids courtesy of Mrs. Henderson, who'd taken her for the night. Papa, you look handsome, she announced solemnly. You look beautiful, sweetheart. Jonas knelt to straighten her collar. Are you ready for today? I've been ready forever, Ellie replied with the exasperation of a child who'd been waiting for something wonderful. Are you ready? Jonas thought about the question seriously. Was he ready? Ready to take this step, to make this commitment, to trust in love again after loss? Ready to believe that happiness could last, that hearts could be given without being broken? Yeah, Ellie girl, he said softly. I think I finally am. The church was packed when they arrived. It seemed the entire town had turned out for the wedding, despite the short notice and simple preparations. Flowers donated from various gardens decorated the altar. The church ladies had hung white ribbons along the pews. Reverend Matthews stood at the front, beaming with genuine pleasure. Jonas took his place at the altar with Dave Peterson standing beside him as best man. Ellie waited at the back of the church, clutching a small bouquet of wildflowers and bouncing on her toes with barely contained excitement. And then the door opened and Clara appeared. Jonas's breath caught in his throat. She wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk with lace at the collar and cuffs. Her auburn hair was pinned up with small white flowers woven through it. She carried a bouquet of early spring blooms, crocuses and daffodils and branches of pussy willow. But it was her face that captured Jonas's attention, radiant with joy, eyes bright with happy tears, a smile that made his heart stutter. Mrs. Henderson, standing in as Clara's attendant in the absence of family, gave her arm a squeeze before releasing her to walk down the aisle. Clara moved forward alone, chin high. That same courage she'd shown walking into burning barns now carrying her toward a different kind of leap of faith. Their eyes met halfway down the aisle, and Jonas felt everything else fall away. The watching crowd, the flowers, the ceremony itself, all of it faded into background noise. All that mattered was Clara, moving toward him with tears streaming down her face and love blazing in her eyes. When she reached the altar, Jonas took her hands, holding tight like she was an anchor in a storm. You're beautiful, he whispered. You're not so bad yourself, Clara replied, her voice trembling with laughter and tears. Reverend Matthews cleared his throat, bringing their attention back to the ceremony. Dearly beloved, he began, and Jonas tried to focus on the words, tried to absorb the meaning of the vows they were about to exchange. But his attention kept drifting to Clara's face, to the way her hands trembled in his, to the ring waiting in his pocket that would mark her as his wife. The traditional vows were exchanged, for better or worse, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer. Jonas spoke his clearly, meaning every word with an intensity that made his voice shake. But then Reverend Matthews surprised them. I've asked Jonas and Clara to share their own vows as well, he said, promises specific to the life they're building together. Jonas hadn't known Clara was going to do this. He looked at her in surprise, and she smiled apologetically. I hope you don't mind, she said softly. But there were things I needed to say. She turned to face him fully, still holding his hands, her eyes locked on his. Jonas Merrick, she began, her voice steady now despite the tears. I vow to honor the past while building our future. I will never try to erase Sarah's memory or take her place in Ellie's heart. Instead, I'll create my own place beside it, loving your daughter as my own while respecting the mother she lost. Jonas felt his throat tighten, tears pricking his own eyes. Clara continued, I vow to be brave when fear would paralyze us, to choose courage over comfort, to walk into whatever fires come our way because I trust you to walk beside me. I vow to be your partner in building this ranch, this family, this life, not just a decoration or an assistant, but an equal contributor to everything we create together. She paused, taking a shaky breath. And I vow to love you not just in the easy moments, but through the hard ones too. Through the doubts and fears and challenges that will inevitably come. Through the winners of our life together, trusting that spring always comes if we're patient enough to wait for it. You've taught me that hearts can heal, that love can bloom more than once. I vow to honor that lesson by giving you my whole heart, damaged and repaired, and stronger for having been broken. By the time she finished, Jonas couldn't see clearly through his tears. He squeezed her hands, then took his own shaky breath. I didn't prepare anything, he admitted. But Clara, I vow to keep choosing courage over fear, to keep pushing forward instead of staying frozen in grief, to trust in our love even when doubt creeps in, which it will, because I'm human and scared and desperately afraid of losing someone I love again. He saw understanding flood Clara's face, saw her nod encouragement. I vow to build you a life worthy of the sacrifice you've made, Jonas continued. You left everything familiar, everyone you knew, to take a chance on a widowed cowboy and his daughter. I vow to make that sacrifice worth it, to create a home where you feel valued and loved and essential, not just tolerated or accepted, but truly cherished. His voice dropped lower, more intimate despite the crowd. I vow to be honest with you about my fears and failures, to not hide behind walls of protection or false strength, to let you see me fully, the good, the bad, the still healing parts, and to trust you won't turn away when you see my imperfections. He took one hand from hers, reaching up to cup her face, his thumb wiping away tears. And I vow to love you with everything I have, every day, for the rest of our lives. To choose you again and again, in every moment, through every season. You've given me back my life, Clara. I vow to spend that life making sure you never regret it. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. Even Reverend Matthews had to pause and clear his throat several times before continuing. The ring exchange was almost anticlimactic after the emotional weight of their vows. Jonas slid his grandmother's ring onto Clara's finger for the second time. Officially now, binding. Clara slid a simple gold band onto his finger, the metal warm from being clutched in her hand. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana and by God above, Reverend Matthews said, his voice thick with emotion, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jonas, you may kiss your bride. Jonas pulled Clara into his arms and kissed her with every ounce of love and promise and hope he had in him. The congregation erupted in cheers and applause, but Jonas barely heard it. All his focus was on the woman in his arms, his wife, his partner, his second chance at happiness. When they finally pulled apart, both breathless and grinning, Ellie launched herself at them with a shriek of joy. Mama Clara, Papa, we're a real family now. They wrapped her in their embrace, the three of them forming a tight circle while the church celebrated around them. Jonas looked over Ellie's head to meet Clara's eyes, saw the same overwhelming joy reflected there that he felt in his own chest. This was it. This was the moment everything changed, the moment the frozen cowboy truly thawed, the moment the cautious schoolteacher fully committed, the moment a little girl's Christmas wish came completely true. The reception was held in the church hall, with tables laden with food contributed by every family in town. There was dancing and laughter and toasts that ranged from heartfelt to humorous. Dave Peterson gave a speech about how Jonas had saved his horses and found love in the same breath, causing both the bride and groom to blush furiously. Martha Henderson described Clara's arrival in town and how quickly she'd won everyone's hearts, but it was Ellie's toast that made everyone cry. The 6-year-old stood on a chair, gripping a cup of cider, her face serious and sweet. "I asked Santa for a mother for Christmas," she said in her clear child's voice, "and he brought me Mama Clara, but he also brought Papa someone to love, and me someone to teach me things, and all of us someone who makes our family whole again. So thank you, Santa, and thank you, Mama Clara, for choosing us." She raised her cup, and the entire room raised theirs in response, cheering and wiping tears. As the afternoon wore into evening, Jonas and Clara managed to steal a few moments alone on the church steps, watching the sun begin its descent toward the mountains. "Are you happy?" Jonas asked, his arm around her waist, holding her close against his side. "Deliriously," Clara replied, leaning her head on his shoulder, "though I still can't quite believe this is real, that I'm actually your wife now." "Believe it," Jonas said, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You're stuck with me now, Mrs. Merrick." Clara smiled at the name. "Mrs. Merrick. I like the sound of that." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the play of light on the mountains. Then Clara said, "Jonas, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have mentioned before, but I was afraid." Jonas's stomach clenched. "What is it?" Clara turned to face him, taking his hands. "I'm not wealthy. In fact, I'm fairly poor. The money I got from selling my jewelry paid for my journey here and little else. I don't have a dowry to bring to this marriage, no savings to contribute. Everything I own fits in 2 trunks. I'm bringing nothing material to this partnership, just myself and my ability to teach," and Jonas stopped her with a kiss, gentle and reassuring. "Clara, I don't care about money or dowries or what you can bring materially. You're bringing yourself, your mind, your courage, your heart. That's worth more than any amount of money. We'll build our wealth together, from the ground up. That's how it should be." Clara's eyes filled with tears again. "I don't deserve you." "We deserve each other," Jonas corrected. 2 broken people who were brave enough to heal together. As darkness fell, they returned to the party long enough to say their goodbyes and endure good-natured teasing about their wedding night. Then they collected Ellie, who would be staying with the Hendersons for the night, and prepared to head home to the ranch. But Ellie had one more surprise for them. As they stood by the wagon, she pulled a small package from her pocket and thrust it at Clara. "What's this?" Clara asked, carefully unwrapping the brown paper. Inside was a hand-drawn picture. 2 adult figures and 1 small one standing in front of a house with mountains in the background. Above them, written in Ellie's careful printing, "Our family." "I made it for you," Ellie said shyly. "So you'd always remember that we're a family now, forever." Clara pulled Ellie into a fierce hug, crying openly now. "Thank you, sweetheart. It's the most beautiful gift I've ever received. I'll treasure it always." After dropping Ellie at the Hendersons, Jonas and Clara made the drive to the ranch in the gathering darkness. The conversation was sparse, both of them suddenly aware that they were truly alone for the first time as husband and wife, that tonight would mark a new intimacy in their relationship. When they reached the ranch house, Jonas helped Clara down from the wagon with unusual formality, but instead of immediately going inside, Clara caught his hand. "Can we stay out here for a moment? Look at the stars." They stood in the yard, looking up at the vast Montana sky blazing with stars. The air was cold, but not bitter, carrying the promise of true spring on the breeze. "I used to look at these stars in Boston," Clara said quietly, "and wonder if somewhere someone was looking at the same stars and feeling as lost as I did, as alone. I never imagined that person might be here waiting for me, about to become my whole future." Jonas pulled her close, wrapping his coat around both of them. "I used to look at these stars and see only emptiness, everything above, nothing below but loneliness. Now when I look at them, I see possibility, beauty, hope." They stood there for a long time, holding each other under the stars, before finally going inside to begin their life together, in truth. The house was warm, a fire crackling in the hearth, candles lit throughout the rooms. Jonas had prepared everything earlier, wanting Clara to feel welcomed, cherished. "It's perfect," Clara whispered, taking in the flowers on the table, the fresh linens, the small touches that spoke of care and anticipation. Jonas, thank you for all of this, for taking a chance on me, for letting me into your heart. Jonas cupped her face in his hands, looking into eyes that held his entire future. Thank you for being brave enough to take that chance, for coming all this way, for choosing us. They came together in a kiss that held everything, promises and hope and love and desire and the sweet relief of finally being home. When they eventually made their way upstairs, it was with the knowledge that they were building something new together, something that honored the past while embracing the future. Spring bloomed fully over the following weeks, transforming the valley into a riot of green and color. Clara settled into ranch life with remarkable ease, balancing her teaching duties with learning the practical skills needed to be a rancher's wife. Jonas watched with admiration as she threw herself into everything, learning to milk the cow, to tend the chickens, to preserve food and manage a household. But she also brought changes that improved their lives in ways Jonas hadn't anticipated. She reorganized the house with efficient practicality, making everything more functional. She started the vegetable garden she'd planned, enlisting Ellie's help in planting seeds and teaching her about where food came from. She brought books and learning into their daily routine, reading aloud in the evenings and encouraging conversations about ideas and dreams. Most importantly, she loved them, fully, completely, without reservation. She loved Ellie as her own daughter, patient with her questions and firm with her misbehavior, celebrating her successes and comforting her failures. She loved Jonas with a passion tempered by tenderness, supporting his dreams while gently pushing him to grow beyond his comfortable boundaries. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Clara made an announcement that stopped Jonas's breath. "I'm pregnant," she said quietly, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "About 6 weeks along, the doctor thinks." Jonas stared at her, his mind spinning. A baby. They were having a baby. He was going to be a father again. How do you feel about it?" he managed to ask. Clara smiled, that radiant expression that still made his heart skip. Terrified, thrilled, overwhelmed, grateful, all of it at once. She turned to him, taking his hand. "Is it too soon? I know we've only been married 2 months, and maybe we should have waited." Jonas kissed her, cutting off the worried words. "It's perfect timing. Any time would be perfect timing. Clara, we're going to have a baby." The wonder in his voice made Clara laugh through happy tears. "We are. Due sometime in January, the doctor thinks." "Ellie's going to be over the moon." "I know." Clara leaned against him, both of them watching the last light fade from the sky. "Jonas, I'm so happy. Happier than I ever thought possible. You've given me everything I didn't even know I wanted. A home, a family, a purpose beyond just existing." "You've done the same for me," Jonas replied, his arm tightening around her. "You've taught me how to live again, how to love again, how to believe in futures instead of just surviving the present." They told Ellie the next morning over breakfast. Her reaction was everything they'd hoped for and more. Pure, unfiltered joy that had her jumping and shrieking and asking 100 questions about when the baby would arrive and whether it would be a boy or girl and if she could help take care of it. "You're going to be a big sister," Clara said, pulling Ellie into her lap despite the child's wriggling excitement. "That's a very important job. It means helping us, teaching the baby things, being patient when they cry, loving them even when they're annoying." "I can do that," Ellie said seriously. "I'm very good at important jobs." The summer passed in a haze of joy and hard work. Jonas hired 2 ranch hands to help with the expansion, finally accepting that he couldn't manage everything alone. Clara taught through the summer session, though Jonas noticed her energy flagging as the pregnancy progressed. By August, she'd stopped teaching to focus on preparing for the baby and managing the household. The town rallied around them again just as they had for the wedding. The church ladies organized a quilting bee to make baby blankets. Martha Henderson hosted a baby shower that Clara attended with bemused gratitude, overwhelmed by the generosity of their community. Dave Peterson built a beautiful wooden cradle as a gift, presenting it with gruff pride. As fall arrived and Clara's belly swelled with obvious pregnancy, Jonas found himself filled with a contentment so complete it sometimes scared him. Life had become almost too good, and some superstitious part of him worried that such happiness couldn't last, that fate would find a way to balance the scales. But Clara, sensing his fears during one of their late-night conversations, took his hand and placed it on her stomach, where the baby was kicking. "Feel that?" she said softly. "That's life, Jonas. Real, tangible, continuing life. We're creating a future together. Nothing about that is too good to be true. It's just true." Jonas felt the flutter of movement under his palm, his child, their child, growing strong and healthy. And in that moment, he finally let go of the last remnants of fear. He chose to trust in the happiness they'd built, to believe it would last, to stop waiting for disaster and start simply living. Winter came early that year, arriving in November with heavy snows and bitter cold. Clara's pregnancy had progressed beautifully, though she grew more uncomfortable as the baby got larger. By December, she was restricted to the house, unable to manage the icy conditions outside. But inside, the house was warm and full of life. Ellie helped Clara bake Christmas cookies, standing on a stool to reach the counter, flour dusting her face and hands. Jonas strung lights and hung decorations while Clara directed from her chair by the fire. They sang carols and told stories and counted down the days until both Christmas and the baby's arrival. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after Clara had first come to dinner at the ranch, they sat together by the fire, Ellie between them, watching snow fall outside the windows. "Do you remember last Christmas?" Clara asked, her hand resting on her very pregnant belly. "When you invited me here for the first time?" "I remember being terrified," Jonas admitted. "Terrified of what I was feeling, what it might mean, where it might lead. And now?" Jonas looked at his wife, her belly round with their child, her face glowing in the firelight, their daughter dozing against her side, and felt his heart overflow. "Now I'm just grateful," he said. "Grateful for Ellie's wish, for your courage, for second chances. Grateful for every day I get to spend with you both." Clara reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. "A year ago, I was alone in a boarding house in a strange town, wondering if I'd made the biggest mistake of my life coming here. Now I'm sitting in my home with my husband and daughter, about to welcome another child, surrounded by love I never imagined possible. If this is a mistake, I never want to be right." Ellie stirred, blinking sleepily. "Is it Christmas yet?" "Not yet, sweetheart," Clara said, stroking her hair. "But soon." "Good, because this year I don't need to wish for anything. I already have everything I wanted." Ellie snuggled deeper into Clara's side. "We're a real family now, forever and ever." Jonas and Clara exchanged a look over Ellie's head, both blinking back tears. A year ago, they'd been 3 separate people carrying their own griefs and fears. Now they were a family, bonded by love and choice and the courage to hope. 2 weeks later, on a frigid January morning, Clara went into labor. The birth was long and difficult, with Jonas pacing the floor downstairs while the doctor and Mrs. Henderson attended Clara upstairs. Ellie stayed with the Petersons, kept away from the intensity of childbirth, but anxiously awaiting news. When Jonas was finally called upstairs, the sun was rising, painting the room in shades of gold and pink. Clara lay exhausted in their bed, her hair damp with sweat, her face pale but radiant, and in her arms, wrapped in one of the quilts the church ladies had made, was a tiny baby. "It's a girl," Clara said softly, as Jonas approached with trembling steps. "A daughter, for both of us." Jonas sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the impossibly small face, the tiny hands curled into fists, the rosebud mouth. His daughter, their daughter. "She's perfect," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Absolutely perfect." "Would you like to hold her?" Jonas took the baby with careful reverence, cradling her against his chest. She was so light, so fragile, so utterly precious. Tears streamed down his face as he looked at this new life they'd created together. "What should we name her?" Clara asked. Jonas had been thinking about this for months, waiting for this moment. "Sarah Hope," he said quietly. "Sarah for my first wife, who gave me Ellie. Hope for what you've given me, the ability to believe in futures again." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Sarah Hope Merrick, It's beautiful, perfect. When Ellie was brought home later that morning to meet her baby sister, her reaction was everything they'd hoped for. She climbed carefully onto the bed, peering at the tiny bundle with wide eyes. "She's so small," Ellie breathed. "Can I hold her?" Jonas helped position Ellie carefully, supporting the baby while Ellie cradled her with intense concentration. "Hello, Sarah Hope," Ellie whispered. "I'm your big sister, Ellie. I'm going to teach you everything and protect you always and love you forever. You're so lucky because you got the best mama and papa in the whole world. And you know what? We're all here because I wished for a family for Christmas. And Santa brought us Mama Clara, and Mama Clara brought us you. So we're all connected by wishes and love and magic." Jonas and Clara watched their daughters together, one dark-haired and serious, one tiny and new, and felt the circle of their family complete itself. This was what they'd been building toward, this moment of perfect peace and joy, of love multiplied instead of divided. As spring returned to Montana territory, the second spring of their marriage, the first spring of Sarah Hope's life, the Merrick Ranch flourished. The herd had expanded. The new barn was completed. Clara's garden was thriving. The ranch hands Jonas had hired proved capable and trustworthy, giving him more time to spend with his family. Clara had decided not to return to teaching full-time, at least not while Sarah Hope was young. But she'd started offering evening lessons for adults who wanted to learn to read, turning the schoolhouse into a community center exactly as she'd dreamed. Ellie was growing like a weed, becoming more confident and capable each day. She doted on her baby sister with fierce devotion, and Jonas often found her standing by the cradle, singing the lullabies Clara had taught her or telling baby Sarah Hope stories about their family. One evening in late April, Jonas stood on the porch watching the sun set over the valley, while Clara nursed Sarah Hope in the rocking chair beside him, and Ellie played in the yard. The air was warm, filled with the scent of new growth and possibility. "What are you thinking about?" Clara asked softly. Jonas turned to look at her, his wife, nursing their daughter, the evening light making her glow like something holy. "I'm thinking about how close I came to missing all of this. If Ellie hadn't made that wish, if you hadn't been brave enough to come to Montana, if I hadn't found the courage to let you in. We were both so close to staying frozen, staying safe, staying alone." "But we didn't," Clara said. "We chose courage over fear. We chose each other." "Best decision I ever made." Jonas moved to sit on the porch step, close enough to touch Clara's knee. "You know what the amazing thing is? I thought my life was over when Sarah died. Thought I'd used up my allotment of happiness. But this, you, our life together, it's different from what I had before, but it's not less. It's just new." Another chapter instead of the end of the story. Clara reached down to stroke his hair, her touch gentle. "That's what second chances are, Jonas. They're not replacements for what we lost. They're new beginnings built on the foundation of our experiences. We love better because we've lost before. We appreciate more because we know how quickly things can change. We're braver because we've survived the worst and came out the other side." Ellie ran up to the porch, her face flushed from playing. "Papa, Mama, Clara, can we have a story before bed?" "Of course, sweetheart," Clara replied. "Go wash up and put on your nightgown. We'll be inside in a minute." As Ellie ran inside, Clara and Jonas sat in comfortable silence, listening to the evening sounds of their ranch. Cattle lowing in the distance, horses nickering in the barn, the wind sighing through the new leaves on the trees. "Do you ever regret it?" Jonas asked suddenly. "Leaving Boston, leaving your old life, coming all this way to end up on a ranch in the middle of nowhere with a cowboy and his baggage." Clara looked down at the baby in her arms, then out at the valley spread before them, then finally at Jonas. Her smile was soft and certain. "Not for a single second," she said. "This isn't nowhere, Jonas. This is home. You're not baggage. You're my husband, my partner, my love. And this life we're building? It's everything I ever wanted and nothing I knew to wish for. So no, I don't regret it. I'd make the same choice 1,000 times over." Jonas felt his throat tighten with emotion. Even after more than a year of marriage, Clara still had the power to undo him with her words. "I love you," he said simply, "more than I can ever properly express." "I know," Clara replied, her eyes shining. "I love you too. Now come inside. Our daughter is waiting for her story, and I think it's your turn to tell it." They went inside together. Jonas, Clara, baby Sarah Hope, and Ellie, gathering in the living room for their nightly ritual. Jonas settled into his chair with Ellie on his lap, while Clara nursed the baby nearby. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, but inside, the house glowed with warmth and love. "Tell the one about the cowboy and the teacher," Ellie requested, as she did most nights now. Jonas pretended to think about it. "Let's see. Once upon a time, there was a lonely cowboy who lived in a valley with his young daughter. They were sad because they'd lost someone they loved, and the cowboy had forgotten how to hope for better days." "And then what happened?" Ellie prompted, even though she knew the story by heart. "Then one Christmas, his daughter made a wish. She asked Santa for something the cowboy thought was impossible. But sometimes," Jonas continued, catching Clara's eye across the room, "the impossible finds a way to happen anyway. A brave teacher came to town from far away, and she showed the cowboy how to be brave too, how to take chances, how to believe in second chances and new beginnings." "And they fell in love," Ellie said with satisfaction. "They did. And they got married, and they had a baby, and they built a life together that was different from what either of them expected, but better than anything they'd dreamed. And they lived happily ever after," Ellie finished triumphantly. Jonas smiled, pressing a kiss to his daughter's head. "Not just happily ever after, sweetheart. They lived fully ever after. Every day, choosing courage and love and hope over fear and loneliness and grief. That's the real magic. Not that everything became perfect, but that they became brave enough to build something beautiful, despite knowing how quickly things can change." Later, after both girls were asleep and Jonas and Clara lay in bed together, Clara spoke into the darkness. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For choosing me, for letting me choose you, for building this life with me, for Sarah Hope and for Ellie, and for every day we get to wake up together, for all of it." Jonas pulled her close, breathing in the familiar scent of her hair, feeling the solid warmth of her body against his. "The thank you goes both ways, Clara. You gave me back my life. You taught me how to thaw out, how to feel again, how to trust that happiness can last. You gave me a second chance at fatherhood, at marriage, at being whole. I'll spend the rest of my life being grateful for that." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, secure in their love and in the family they'd built together. Outside, the Montana stars blazed overhead, bearing witness to the miracle that had begun one snowy Christmas with a little girl's wish and a cowboy's trembling hope. Years later, when people asked Jonas about how he met his wife, he'd smile and say it was all thanks to Ellie. That his daughter had wished for a mother for Christmas, and somehow, impossibly, Santa had delivered. Clara would laugh and add that sometimes the greatest gifts are the ones we're brave enough to reach for ourselves. And Ellie, growing older but still believing in the magic of that Christmas, would remind everyone that wishes only come true when you're willing to work for them. That her papa had found love again because he'd chosen courage over fear. That Mama Clara had found her home because she'd been willing to travel across the country for a fresh start. And that their family existed because 3 people had been brave enough to love despite their fears. The ranch continued to prosper. More children came, twin boys when Sarah Hope was 3, another daughter 2 years after that. The house expanded to accommodate the growing family, filled with laughter and occasional chaos and constant love. Clara taught for years, eventually becoming superintendent of schools for the entire county. Jonas built his ranch into one of the most successful operations in Montana Territory, but never at the expense of his family. And every Christmas they'd gather by the fire, however many of them there were by then, and remember that snowy December night when everything changed. When a little girl's wish, a cowboy's courage, and a teacher's hope had come together to create something beautiful and lasting and true. Because that's what second chances look like. Not perfect, but precious. Not without challenges, but filled with love worth fighting for. Not the end of old stories, but the beginning of new ones. And Jonas Merrick, the cowboy who thought his heart was frozen forever, lived the rest of his days grateful for the Christmas miracle that had taught him how to thaw. Grateful for the woman who'd taken a chance on a grieving widower and his daughter. Grateful for every moment of the full, rich, joyous life they'd built together. His Christmas wish, like Ellie's, had come true in ways more wonderful than he'd ever imagined possible. He'd found love again, built a family again, learned to hope again, and he discovered that hearts are infinitely expandable, capable of holding both grief and joy, both past and future, both the memories of what was lost and the celebration of what was found. That was the real miracle of Christmas. Not that wishes were granted by magic, but that people were brave enough to make them come true through love and courage and the willingness to try again despite fear. And in a small valley in Montana Territory, that miracle happened every day in the lives of the Merrick family, proof that second chances were real if you were bold enough to reach for them. The end.